My name is Gemma Harrison, and I am 31 years old. Just a month ago, I sat at my parents' mahogany dining table while my father pushed a freshly printed quitclaim deed across the polished wood. The document listed the address of my $750,000 Austin home. The blank signature line at the bottom demanded I hand the property over to my younger sister, Savannah. Across the table, Savannah cradled her perfectly flat stomach and traced the rim of her crystal water glass. She did not look at me. My mother stood behind her with a manicured hand resting heavily on Savannah's shoulder. The room smelled like expensive potpourri and burnt coffee. My mother looked down at me with cold eyes and said, "If you loved your sister, you would sign this today." She said Savannah is starting a family and needs the space, while I am just a single woman taking up too much room. My father crossed his arms and told me if I refused to sign my own house away, I would no longer be part of this family. He said I would be disowned and forgotten by the end of the week. I sat very still, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I looked at the crisp white paper. I looked at my father's heavy silver pen waiting beside it. My hands did not shake. My breathing did not change. I simply smiled, picked up the pen, and signed my name on the line. My sister cheered and clapped her hands together. My mother leaned down to hug her, and my father told me I had finally done the right thing for once in my life. But here is what none of them knew as they celebrated taking everything I had built. I am a land acquisition manager. I negotiate commercial real estate for a living, and I never purchase property in my own personal name. The piece of paper they just blackmailed me into signing was legally worthless. What happened when the title company finally called my father to process the deed, how the color drained from his face when he heard the truth, and what the county sheriff handed my sister 3 days later. I will get there. I promise you, the look on their faces is worth staying for. Welcome to Cherry Drama Stories, where quiet women finally outsmart the loudest people in the room. If you have ever been the child expected to sacrifice your own life for a golden sibling, tell me your age in the comments, and be sure to subscribe so you do not miss what happens when a woman stops crying and starts filing paperwork. Let me take you back to the beginning to show you exactly how a family decides they are entitled to the roof over your head. I grew up in a house where love was treated like a finite resource, and Savannah held the monopoly on it. We live in Texas, where independence is practically a religion. We are raised on stories of the Alamo and taught that you draw a line in the sand and defend your borders. But in my family, those rules only applied to the outside world. Inside our walls, my borders were considered public property. Savannah is 3 years younger than me, but my parents always handled her as if she were made of thin glass. If Savannah failed a college class, the professor was unreasonable, and my father paid for a tutor. If I worked double shifts to afford my own textbooks, my mother called me obsessed with money. You learn quickly that arguing with that kind of logic is like trying to empty a river with a spoon. You cannot win. So I stopped trying to win and started building an exit strategy. 3 years ago, my exit strategy took the shape of a house in the hill country just outside Austin. It sits at the end of a long limestone driveway lined with old cedar trees. It has 4 bedrooms, a deep wraparound porch, and a western view where the sky turns the color of a struck match every evening at sunset. The appraisal came in at $750,000. I did not ask my parents for a down payment. I did not ask for a co-signer. I saved my corporate bonuses, lived in a cramped studio apartment for 6 years, and negotiated the closing myself. On my kitchen island, which is a heavy slab of veined white quartz, I keep an antique brass key. I bought it at a local flea market the morning I signed the closing papers. I keep it sitting on the quartz just to look at it. It is cold and heavy and real. It is a tangible reminder of what I built with my own 2 hands. My house became my sanctuary. It was quiet. It smelled like cedar and fresh air instead of my mother's heavy perfume. I hosted Thanksgiving there once, thinking it would prove to my parents that I was a successful adult worthy of their respect. That was a mistake. Instead of respect, they looked at my vaulted ceilings and custom oak cabinets with a strange, creeping resentment. My mother ran her finger along the quartz countertop and sighed. She told my father it was a shame that so much beautiful space was wasted on a single woman who was never home. She said a house like this needs children in it. Savannah was standing right beside her, sipping wine and nodding. I saw the look in Savannah's eyes that day. It was the specific, hungry look she used to get when we were children, and I had a toy she wanted. I ignored it. I thought the law protected me from greedy eyes. The real trouble began a few months ago on a Sunday morning. My parents hosted brunch at their house. The dining room table was crowded with platters of eggs and bacon, but the air felt thin and tense. Savannah and her husband Liam arrived late. They live in a cramped two-bedroom apartment downtown and constantly complain about the lack of parking and the thin walls. Liam is a man who speaks mostly in sighs and unfinished sentences. Savannah sat down, refused a mimosa, and placed both hands flat on her stomach. She announced she was pregnant. My mother shrieked with joy. My father stood up and kissed Savannah's forehead. I smiled and offered my congratulations, genuinely hoping motherhood might ground her. But the celebration quickly shifted into a planning session, and I felt the crosshairs settle onto the back of my neck. My mother poured more coffee and shook her head sadly. She looked directly at Liam and then at me. Savannah needs a real yard for the baby, she said. A two-bedroom apartment is no place to raise my grandchild. The stairs alone are a hazard. Liam stared at his plate and muttered something about housing prices being too high. Savannah touched her stomach again and let out a soft, practiced sigh. We have been looking, but everything in our budget is so small. It breaks my heart to think of the baby having no room to play. My father looked at me. His jaw was set tight. Gemma has 4 bedrooms, he said. His voice was not a question. It was a ledger balancing itself. 4 bedrooms and an acre of land. And nobody to share it with. I set my coffee cup down. The ceramic clinked sharply against the saucer. I told them Savannah and Liam had plenty of time to save for a starter home before the baby started walking. I kept my voice light and professional, the same tone I use when a commercial developer asks for an unreasonable concession. I offered to help them look at real estate listings. Savannah's eyes filled with immediate tears. She pushed her chair back from the table and walked out of the room, crying into her hands. My mother glared at me like I had just struck her golden child. She told me I was selfish and cold. I left the brunch early, stepping out into the brutal Texas heat, feeling a strange knot forming in my stomach. I thought that would be the end of it. I assumed it was just another passive-aggressive guilt trip. But manipulators do not stop when you say no. They simply change their tactics. The following Saturday, Savannah stopped by my house unannounced. She claimed she was just in the neighborhood and needed to use the restroom. I let her in. She wandered through my living room, trailing her fingers over the back of my sofa. She stood in front of the large picture window, looking out at the limestone drive. "This lighting is so good," she murmured. I stood by the kitchen island, waiting for her to leave. She stayed for 20 minutes, talking about cribs and baby names. When she finally walked out the front door, I went to the kitchen sink to wash our water glasses. That is when I saw it. Resting right next to my antique brass key on the quartz island was a thick, glossy catalog. The cover featured pastel nursery furniture. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked it up. It felt heavy in my hands. The pages were dog-eared. One page was folded open to a high-end white crib placed in a room with a large picture window. A window that looked exactly like mine. She had not left it there by accident. It was a stake in the ground. It was her claiming territory. I walked straight to the recycling bin and dropped the catalog inside. The heavy thud of the glossy paper hitting the plastic bin echoed in the empty kitchen. I went back to my quartz island and picked up the brass key, feeling the cold metal against my palm. I knew my family. I knew this was not over. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a chain of title for a new corporate site. It was my father. He told me to come to their house for dinner on Tuesday night. He did not ask if I was available. He simply stated the time and hung up. I looked at the dark screen of my phone. The knot in my stomach pulled tight. I did not know they had already printed a quitclaim deed. I did not know they were planning to threaten my place in the family. But as I sat in my office surrounded by legal files and property maps, a quiet calm washed over me. I packed my briefcase and prepared to go to dinner. The glossy pages of the nursery catalog sat in my recycling bin, surrounded by empty coffee filters and discarded junk mail. I stared at it the next morning while waiting for my espresso machine to warm up. The pastel crib on the cover stared back at me. In the daylight, the catalog felt less like a heavy-handed hint and more like a scout sent ahead of an invading army. I poured my coffee and walked out to the wraparound porch. The morning air already carried the thick, sticky weight of the Texas heat. I looked out over the limestone driveway and the line of old cedar trees marking my property line. In my profession, we call this a boundary survey. You establish where your sovereignty ends and your neighbor's begins. My sister Savannah did not believe in boundaries. She believed in accommodations. I drove downtown to my office. My firm occupies the 14th floor of a glass building overlooking the Colorado River. My desk is usually covered in plat maps, zoning applications, and environmental impact reports. Land acquisition is not a sentimental business. It requires a cold eye and a steady hand. You learn to read the fine print because the fine print is where people hide their true intentions. My colleagues respect me. They know I can negotiate a parcel of ranch land out from under a stubborn developer without raising my voice. But when I step out of that office and answer a call from my family, my resume evaporates. To them, I am just the unmarried older sister, a blank slate waiting to be assigned a purpose. My desk phone rang at 11. The caller ID displayed my mother's cell number. I let it ring twice before picking up the receiver. Brenda never calls during business hours unless she wants to complain about Savannah. I answered with my standard professional greeting. My mother bypassed any pleasantries. She launched directly into a long, breathless monologue about how poorly Savannah was sleeping. Her back is aching, Gemma. The stairs at their apartment complex are becoming a hazard. Liam works such long hours, and I worry she might trip carrying groceries. I kept my eyes on a zoning map. I asked if they had considered breaking their lease to find a ground floor unit. I offered to connect them with a leasing agent I knew who specialized in short-term rentals. A sharp scoff echoed through the receiver. She does not need another rental, my mother snapped. Rentals are for college students and bachelors. She is bringing a child into this world. She needs stability. She needs grass and neighborhood, space to breathe. The silence stretched between us. I tapped my pen against my desk. I knew exactly what she wanted me to say. She wanted me to volunteer my home. She wanted me to apologize for hoarding 4 bedrooms and eagerly hand over my keys. In her mind, my house was an unused family asset. A single woman with a mortgage did not fit her traditional narrative. A woman alone in a large house was an anomaly to be corrected. When I did not offer my house, my mother sighed. It was a practiced theatrical sound. "It is just a shame," she said softly. "Some people have more space than they know what to do with, while others are suffocating. We all have to make sacrifices for family, Gemma. Remember that." The line went dead. I hung up the phone and went back to my plat map. The tension in my jaw remained for the rest of the afternoon. The psychological warfare escalated that evening. I pulled into my driveway just as the sun began to dip below the hills, casting long shadows across the limestone. Another car was parked near my garage. It was a dented silver sedan, Liam's car. He was standing on my front porch wearing scuffed work boots and looking deeply uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from foot to foot as I walked up the steps. I asked him why he was standing on my porch on a Monday evening. He ran a hand through his hair and looked down at his boots. "Savannah sent me," he mumbled. "She wanted me to check the dimensions of the guest room, the one facing the backyard. She found a vintage crib online and wants to make sure it clears the window frame." I stopped halfway up the steps. The audacity was so raw, it almost felt like a prank. He was not asking for a favor. He was taking inventory. Savannah had sent her husband to measure my house for her unborn child. "Liam," I said, keeping my voice level, "why would Savannah need to know the dimensions of my guest room?" He looked up, blinking rapidly. "Well, Brenda said you guys were going to figure something out about the space because of the baby." I did not yell. I did not ask him to explain himself. I stepped onto the porch, walked past him, and unlocked my front door. I turned back and looked at him. "The room is 12 by 14, Liam. The crib will fit, but it will not be fitting here. You can tell Savannah she needs to measure her own apartment." I stepped inside and shut the heavy oak door. I engaged the deadbolt. Through the window, I watched Liam trudge back to his car and drive away. The entitlement was no longer a splinter. It was a wedge being driven directly into the foundation of my life. They were coordinating. My mother laid the guilt. Savannah left the visual cues. Liam performed the reconnaissance. They had convinced themselves that my surrender was inevitable. They assumed my refusal was just a temporary stubbornness that could be worn down with enough pressure. The final summons came on Tuesday morning. I received a short text message from my father, Thomas. "Dinner tonight, 7 sharp. We need to finalize some things." He did not ask if I had plans. He did not ask if I wanted to come. The tone was executive. My father ran a logistics company for 30 years before retiring. He managed his household the exact same way he managed his warehouses. Directives were issued and compliance was expected. When I graduated with top honors, he did not ask about my career goals. He asked when I planned to find a husband. When I closed on this house, he spent an hour inspecting the plumbing and the roof, acting as if I had been scammed by the realtor. My achievements were always treated with a baseline of suspicion. I spent Tuesday afternoon preparing for the dinner. I did not dress in casual clothes. I treated the evening like a hostile boardroom negotiation. I wore a tailored navy blazer and pointed shoes. Armor. I drove toward their neighborhood as the rush-hour traffic clogged the interstate. The heat radiating off the asphalt blurred the horizon. My parents live in a manicured subdivision where every house features the same brick facade and identical mailboxes. It is a neighborhood built on conformity and appearances. I pulled to the curb across from their driveway. Savannah's car was already parked next to my father's polished SUV. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, leaving the engine running. The air conditioning hummed. I looked at the front door of my childhood home. I knew what was waiting on the other side. The passive-aggressive hints were over. The measuring tapes and the nursery catalogs had failed to break my boundaries. The time for subtle manipulation had passed. They were bringing out the heavy machinery. I turned off the ignition. I picked up my purse. I walked up the paved walkway, listening to the sharp click of my heels against the concrete. I reached for the brass doorknob. My pulse remained steady. I took a slow, deliberate breath, pushing the heavy wooden door open and stepping into the hallway. The smell of expensive potpourri and roasted meat drifted from the kitchen. I heard my father's voice booming from the dining room, followed by Savannah's bright laughter. I walked toward the archway, preparing to face the tribunal. I stepped through the archway into the formal dining room. The heavy mahogany table was set for 5. A large roasted chicken sat untouched in the center, surrounded by porcelain bowls of vegetables. Steam rose toward the crystal chandelier, but no one was eating. The atmosphere resembled a corporate boardroom right before a hostile takeover is announced. Savannah sat on the left side of the table. She wore a soft pink maternity blouse and rested both hands over her lower abdomen. Liam sat beside her, staring intently at his empty plate. My father stood at the head of the table, wearing his golf slacks and a pressed white shirt. My mother hovered right behind Savannah's chair, resting her hands on her youngest daughter's shoulders like a protective sentry. No one smiled when I entered. No one offered me a glass of wine or asked about the traffic on the interstate. The usual pretenses were stripped away. My father gestured to the single empty chair opposite my sister. I walked over and sat down. The wood of the chair felt hard and unforgiving against my spine. I placed my leather briefcase on the floor next to my feet. I rested my hands on the smooth tabletop and waited. I knew better than to speak first in a room engineered to ambush me. Thomas cleared his throat. He did not reach for the serving spoons. Instead, he reached toward the sideboard and picked up a flat manila envelope. He brought it to the table. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the central air conditioning unit kicking on. My father placed his hand flat on the envelope and slid it across the polished mahogany. The paper made a dry, hissing sound as it traveled over the wood. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my folded hands. I did not touch it immediately. I looked up at my father. His jaw was set in that firm, unyielding line he used when firing warehouse supervisors. "Go ahead," he instructed. "Read it. We need to get this sorted out tonight before the food gets cold." I flipped the manila cover open. Inside rested a single crisp sheet of legal paper. I recognized the formatting instantly because I draft similar paperwork every single week. It was a standard Texas quitclaim deed. My eyes scanned the text, moving past the boilerplate language straight to the property description. The county tax identification number matched my Hill Country lot perfectly. The grantor line held my full legal name. The grantee line displayed Savannah's name in bold black ink. At the bottom, a blank line waited for my signature next to an empty notary block. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I read the document a second time just to ensure I was not hallucinating the sheer audacity of the demand. They had actually paid an attorney or downloaded a form online to formalize the theft of my real estate. I looked across the table. Savannah was watching me closely. A faint, smug smile played at the corners of her mouth. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water, projecting an image of serene entitlement. Liam refused to make eye contact with me. I looked back at my father. I kept my voice in the same calm register I use when a vendor tries to inflate an invoice. "You brought me to dinner to hand me a quitclaim deed," I stated. My voice betrayed no emotion. Thomas nodded once. "We have discussed the situation at length," he began. He used his executive voice. It was the tone of a man accustomed to blind obedience. "Savannah and Liam are starting a family. They are bringing a new life into this world. That apartment is entirely inadequate for a child. You, on the other hand, live alone in a structure built for a large family. The logistics simply do not make sense. We have decided it is best for everyone if you transfer the Austin property to your sister." I sat back in my chair. The phrase "we have decided" echoed in the formal dining room. My parents had convened a committee to reallocate my assets, as if I were a subsidiary branch of their own corporation. I tilted my head slightly. "You are asking me to sign away a house appraised at $750,000, I asked. The words hung in the air, heavy and precise. I wanted them to hear the exact financial magnitude of their demand. I wanted to force them to acknowledge the extortion. "What compensation is being offered for this transfer?" Savannah let out a sharp, offended gasp. She pulled her chair back, scraping the wooden legs against the floor. She placed her hands over her face, imitating profound heartbreak. "How can you talk about money at a time like this?" she wailed through her fingers. "I am carrying your niece or nephew. We are supposed to be a family." My mother stepped forward. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You selfish, ungrateful girl," Brenda hissed. Her voice trembled with practiced righteous indignation. "Your sister is vulnerable. She needs a secure environment to raise her child. You have more money than you know what to do with, and you are choosing to be greedy over a pile of bricks and wood." I did not raise my voice. "The bricks and wood happen to belong to me," I replied. "I paid the down payment. I pay the property taxes. I maintain the insurance. I am not a charity, and Savannah is not a victim of anything except her own poor financial planning." Thomas slammed his open palm against the mahogany table. The crystal glasses rattled. The silver forks clinked against the porcelain plates. "You will not speak to your mother or your sister that way under my roof," he roared. "You have always been cold, Gemma, always calculating. We thought you would eventually learn how to care for other people, but clearly your career has frozen your heart." He leaned over the table. His shadow fell across the quitclaim deed. "We are not negotiating a business deal tonight," he growled. "We are giving you a choice. You can sign that document and prove that you actually value your own flesh and blood, or you can pack your briefcase and walk out that front door." My mother crossed her arms over her chest, sealing the trap. "If you refuse to help your pregnant sister today, you are no longer part of this family," Brenda announced. The words were cold and deliberate. "We will cut you out entirely. You will not be invited to holidays. You will not meet the baby. You will be disowned and forgotten by the end of the week." I sat in the hard wooden chair and looked at the three people surrounding me. The emotional blackmail was fully deployed. This is the tactic manipulators rely on when logic fails them. They weaponize your desire for connection. They threaten you with isolation, assuming the fear of being abandoned will force you to surrender your boundaries. For a fleeting second, I saw the ghosts of my childhood in this room. The little girl who used to try so hard to earn a fraction of the praise they showered on Savannah. The teenager who thought getting straight A grades might finally make them look at her with pride. But that little girl did not live here anymore. She had grown up. She had learned how to read a contract, and sitting at this table looking at the flushed, angry faces of my parents and the smug, expectant face of my sister, I realized something profoundly liberating. I was sitting at a table with strangers. These people did not love me. They loved what they could extract from me. I was not a daughter or a sister to them. I was a resource, and you cannot mourn the loss of a family that never truly existed. The silence in the dining room stretched tight. Savannah lowered her hands from her face, peeking through her fingers to gauge my reaction. Liam swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. My father reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it with a soft click and set it down right next to the blank signature line on the quitclaim deed. "We are waiting," Thomas said. I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the black ink waiting to bind my future to their greed. They expected me to crack. They expected me to cry and beg for their forgiveness, yielding my sanctuary just to keep my seat at their toxic table. They had no idea that a woman trained in corporate real estate knows exactly how to handle a bad contract. You do not argue with people who refuse to operate in good faith. You give them exactly what they ask for and let the paperwork destroy them. I reached my hand out toward the silver pen. My fingers closed around the polished barrel of my father's silver pen. The metal felt heavy and cold against my skin. It was a Mont Blanc, an anniversary gift from my mother a decade ago, and he only ever brought it out to sign significant financial documents. Using it for this occasion was his way of underscoring the magnitude of my surrender. He wanted me to feel the weight of the moment. He wanted me to understand that this was a transaction dictating my permanent place in the family hierarchy. I held the pen suspended above the thick legal paper. In Texas history classes, they teach us about the Siege of the Alamo. They teach us about drawing lines in the sand and making desperate final stands against overwhelming odds. The mythology implies that a true defense requires a loud, bloody confrontation. But my career in corporate real estate has taught me a very different lesson about warfare. Sometimes the most effective strategy is to let the enemy believe they have breached the wall. You let them storm the gates and plant their flag in the courtyard. You let them exhaust their resources, celebrating a victory that does not actually exist. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not list the years I spent eating cheap noodles in a cramped apartment to save my down payment. If I fought them right now, if I raised my voice and defended my right to keep my own property, I would be validating their premise. Fighting implies that the other side has a legitimate claim to the battlefield. Arguing would suggest that their demand was worthy of a debate. It was not. Their demand was an absurdity wrapped in emotional extortion. I looked at the quitclaim deed. The drafting was sloppy, likely pulled from a free legal template website, but the intent was clear. It required the personal signature of Gemma Harrison to convey all rights, title, and interest to Savannah. I lowered the pen. The room held its collective breath. I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting the seconds. I pressed the nib to the signature line. I listened to the smooth, crisp scratch of the metal gliding over the paper. I did not rush. I formed every letter of my name with deliberate care. I signed it personally, precisely as they had drafted it. I dotted the I and crossed the T's with a steady hand. The moment the pen lifted from the page, the suffocating tension in the dining room shattered. Savannah let out a high-pitched squeal. It was the exact same sound she used to make on Christmas morning when she tore open the largest box under the tree. She clapped her hands over her mouth and fresh theatrical tears spilled over her eyelashes. She looked at Liam and hit his shoulder lightly, a gesture of pure, victorious glee. Liam slumped back in his chair, releasing a long, ragged breath. His relief was palpable. He had avoided the uncomfortable task of actually providing for his growing family because his wife had successfully pillaged her older sister's assets. My mother moved instantly. She abandoned her post behind Savannah's chair and rushed around the mahogany table. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a tight embrace. The overwhelming scent of her floral perfume filled my lungs, making my throat burn. It did not feel like a hug. It felt like a restraint. "I knew you would do the right thing," Brenda whispered, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "You are a good sister, Gemma. I am so proud of you for putting family first." I sat perfectly still, allowing her arms to trap me. I managed my own disgust by focusing on a small scratch on the surface of the dining table. My internal monologue remained clinically detached. I categorized her praise for what it was, a receipt for goods rendered. Her affection was a currency she only spent when she got exactly what she wanted. My father picked up the quitclaim deed, handling it as if it were a fragile artifact. He blew gently on the wet ink. He did not say thank you. Gratitude implies a gift, and Thomas believed he was simply collecting a tax I owed them. He slid the document carefully back into the manila envelope and tapped the edges against the table to align the papers. "See how simple that was," he said, offering me a tight, patronizing nod. "There was no need for all that initial stubbornness. This is how a family operates. We take care of our own. Now let us eat before the chicken dries out." I reached down and picked up my leather briefcase from the floor. I stood up, pushing the hard wooden chair back. "I will pass on dinner," I said, keeping my tone mild and polite. "I have an early morning at the office." My mother frowned, her hands dropping from my shoulders. "But we are celebrating," she protested. "We need to toast to the new baby and the new house." I offered a small, closed-mouthed smile. "Enjoy the celebration," I replied. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I did not wait for their dismissals. I did not look back at Savannah wiping her joyful tears, or my father securing the manila envelope under his hand. I walked down the hallway, opened the heavy front door, and stepped out into the Texas night. The brutal daytime heat had broken, leaving a thick, humid warmth in its place. The crickets were chirping loudly in my parents' manicured hedges. I walked down the concrete path to my car. My heels clicked a steady, even rhythm. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. As I pulled away from the curb and navigated out of the subdivision, my chest expanded. A profound sense of quiet settled over me. The audience might wonder why I capitulated with such ease. They might wonder how a woman who negotiates hostile land acquisitions for a living could simply hand over a $750,000 sanctuary without shedding a single tear. The answer lay in the mechanics of the trap I had just set. I drove onto the interstate, pointing my car toward the hill country. The dashboard lights cast a soft blue glow across my hands, resting lightly on the steering wheel. I thought about the ink drying on that piece of paper. My parents believed they had executed a brilliant maneuver. They thought their threats of disownment had broken my spirit. They were blinded by their own entitlement, failing to realize that a personal signature from Gemma Harrison meant nothing. I navigated the winding dark roads leading to my property. I rolled down the window, letting the scent of cedar and dry earth fill the cabin. The cold calculation of my decision insulated me from the pain of their betrayal. When you realize your family views you merely as an obstacle to their own comfort, you stop seeking their approval. You start managing them like hostile liabilities. I turned onto my limestone driveway. The tires crunched satisfyingly over the loose gravel. My house sat at the end of the drive, bathed in the pale light of a full moon. The deep wraparound porch looked welcoming and secure. I parked the car and walked up the wooden steps, taking a moment to run my hand along the sturdy railing. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the cool, silent foyer. I dropped my briefcase on the bench and walked into the kitchen. My antique brass key sat exactly where I had left it, resting on the cold veined quartz of the island. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the heavy metal. I knew my family too well to think this was over. Greedy people lack patience. They do not wait for administrative processes to conclude before staking their claim. My father would want to record the deed immediately to secure the victory. Savannah would want to measure windows and pick out paint colors before the ink was even fully dry. They had the piece of paper they thought gave them sovereignty over my borders. I filled a glass with ice water and took a long, slow drink. I looked around my pristine kitchen, enjoying the perfect, uninterrupted silence. I needed to prepare my personal documents and pack a few essentials. The illusion of their victory was going to make them bold. They were going to cross my threshold thinking they owned the ground they walked on. I just needed to let them step far enough inside the trap before the steel jaws snapped shut. The false sense of security a piece of paper provides is astonishing. I had assumed my family would allow a few days for the dust to settle after the dining room ambush. I thought they would at least wait for the county clerk's office to open and stamp their counterfeit victory. I underestimated their greed. Greed is a highly motivated emotion. It does not observe regular business hours. Friday morning arrived with the sound of a diesel engine idling heavily outside my bedroom window. I was standing in my kitchen grinding coffee beans for my morning espresso. The sharp, bitter scent filled the air, grounding me. I walked to the front window and pulled back the sheer curtain. A large white box truck was backed aggressively into my limestone driveway, crushing the edge of my carefully maintained verbena bed. The physical invasion had begun. Savannah emerged from the passenger side of the truck wearing oversized sunglasses and a bright floral sundress. She pointed toward my front porch, directing Liam, who was already struggling with a large cardboard box labeled nursery decor. My mother Brenda pulled up a moment later in her polished SUV, parking diagonally across the grass. They were moving in before the ink on my useless signature was even fully dry. I did not rush to the door. I did not block the entryway. I walked back to my kitchen island, retrieved my favorite ceramic mug, and poured a fresh cup of coffee. The mug is heavy glazed in deep ocean blue and fits perfectly between my palms. I took a slow sip, letting the hot liquid steady my nerves. In commercial real estate, we call this allowing the opposing party to take possession of a toxic asset. You do not interrupt them when they are enthusiastically boarding a sinking ship. I unlocked the front door and left it standing open. Savannah breezed past me without knocking. She did not say hello. She walked directly into the center of my living room, spun around in a slow circle, and sighed deeply. "The light in here is just spectacular," she announced to no one in particular. Liam followed her, panting slightly under the weight of the box. "Where do you want this, babe?" he asked. "Just set it by the fireplace for now," Savannah instructed. "I need to figure out the flow of the room before we start unpacking the fragile things." My mother walked in last, carrying a clipboard and a measuring tape. She looked around my sanctuary with the critical eye of an auditor. She stopped in front of the open kitchen, evaluating my custom oak cabinets. "These are entirely too dark," Brenda stated, running her hand along the wood grain. "They make the whole space feel oppressive. We will definitely need to have them painted white before the baby arrives. Maybe a soft cream to brighten things up." I sat down on my beige linen sofa, holding my blue ceramic mug. I crossed my legs and watched them dismantle my life in real time. The audacity was breathtaking. They were planning renovations on a property they did not legally possess, discussing paint colors, while the rightful owner sat 10 feet away. In any healthy family, this scene would be a profound violation. But my family operated under the delusion that my assets were merely placeholders until Savannah required them. I watched my mother measure the height of my vaulted ceilings. I watched Liam drag a second box across my hardwood floors, leaving a faint scuff mark near the entryway. The tension in the room was a living thing. Anyone watching would assume I had been broken. They would see a defeated woman sitting silently on her sofa, surrendering her territory to an invading force. But my calm was not surrender. It was a pressure cooker holding the lid down tight while the heat built underneath. I set my mug on the coffee table. I stood up and walked down the hallway to my master bedroom. I pulled a sturdy canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of my closet. I unzipped it and began packing. I did not pack clothes or toiletries. I packed my most critical documents, my passport, my social security card, the hard drive containing my LLC incorporation papers, and the original title policy for the house. I placed a few heirloom pieces of jewelry in the side pocket. I was not retreating. I was securing my essential items before the blast radius expanded. When you know a bomb is going to detonate, you do not stand next to it arguing with the people who lit the fuse. You gather what matters and step behind the blast shield. Savannah appeared in the doorway of my bedroom holding a fabric swatch book. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me carefully place the hard drive into the canvas bag. A smug, satisfied smile stretched across her face. She mistook my organized packing for total defeat. "Do not worry, Gemma," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "You do not have to rush. You can take your time finding an apartment. Liam and I can stay in the guest room until you get your things sorted out. We do not want to put you out on the street." The condescension was a physical blow. She was offering me a temporary reprieve in my own home, framing her invasion as an act of generosity. I zipped the duffel bag closed. I looked at Savannah, noting the way she caressed her stomach, ensuring her status as a mother-to-be remained central to every interaction. "That is very considerate of you, Savannah," I replied, keeping my voice completely void of emotion, "but I am not moving into an apartment." She frowned slightly, confused by my lack of gratitude. "Well," she countered, "you cannot stay here forever. The baby needs a dedicated nursery, and my mother is already contacting contractors for the kitchen remodel." I picked up the duffel bag, slinging the heavy strap over my shoulder. I walked past her toward the hallway. I am well aware of what the baby needs, I said. I am also aware of how contractors operate. They generally require a deposit from the legal owner of the property before they begin demolition. Savannah scoffed, following me back into the living room. Daddy is filing the paperwork this morning, she stated proudly. By noon, it will be official. I stopped near the front door. My mother was standing by the fireplace unwrapping a framed ultrasound photo and placing it squarely on my mantel. Liam was bringing in a third box, this one marked for the master bath. They were moving with a frantic, chaotic energy, desperate to establish occupancy before anyone could question their right to be there. I looked at the blue ceramic mug sitting abandoned on the coffee table. I looked at my mother adjusting the ultrasound frame, perfectly centering it over the hearth. I checked my watch. It was 9 a.m. The county clerk's office had been open for an hour. The title company my father insisted on using was located just 20 minutes away in downtown Austin. The gears of administration were already turning. I walked out the front door carrying my duffel bag. I did not say goodbye. I walked down the porch steps and placed the bag in the trunk of my car. I did not drive away. I sat in the driver's seat, leaving the door open to the morning heat. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the passenger seat. The trap was fully baited. The invaders were inside the walls, arranging their furniture and planning their renovations. They believed the battle was won at the dining room table on Tuesday night. They believed the quitclaim deed was a magic spell that would simply erase my ownership. They were about to learn a very harsh lesson about corporate structure and due diligence. The silence inside my car was heavy with anticipation. I watched the front door of my house, where Savannah occasionally passed by the window, holding a throw pillow or a lamp. I waited for the phone to ring. I knew my father was sitting in an air-conditioned office right now, sliding that piece of paper across a mahogany desk, expecting a clerk to rubber stamp his theft. I knew the clerk would type my name into the county database, and I knew exactly what the screen was going to tell them. I sat in the driver's seat of my car with the air conditioning running on low. Through the windshield, I watched Liam drag a heavy floor lamp across my porch. He was sweating in the morning humidity, his boots leaving faint dusty tracks on the wooden planks. Inside the house, my mother was likely directing the placement of rugs and chairs, dictating the layout of a space she thought she had conquered. They were operating under a fundamental delusion. They believed the piece of paper I signed on Tuesday night gave them dominion over my sanctuary. They were entirely ignorant of the most basic rule of commercial real estate. When I purchased this property 3 years ago, I did not walk into the closing office as Gemma Harrison, private citizen. I walked in as a corporate representative. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that tying your personal identity to a high-value physical asset is a tactical error. It exposes you to unnecessary liability and compromises your privacy. The wealthy do not own things in their own names. They control entities that own things. I took that lesson to heart long before I ever saved enough for a down payment. Weeks before I made the initial offer on the Hill Country property, I logged on to the Texas Secretary of State portal. I paid a standard filing fee and submitted a certificate of formation. In less than 48 hours, the state recognized a brand new legal entity. I named it Lone Star Holdings, LLC. From that moment forward, the company became a distinct artificial person under the eyes of the law. It could enter into contracts, it could incur debt, and most importantly, it could hold the title to real estate. I designated myself as the sole managing member, but that role merely gave me administrative authority to act on behalf of the company. It did not make me the personal owner of its assets. This brings us to the fatal flaw in my father's grand extortion plan. Thomas is a man who spent his entire career managing logistics and barking orders at warehouse employees. He understands supply chains, but he possesses a dangerous arrogance regarding legal procedure. When he decided to steal my home for Savannah, he likely went online and downloaded a free boilerplate quitclaim template. He typed my personal name on the grantor line. He typed Savannah's name on the grantee line. He assumed that because I slept in the master bedroom, I was the deeded owner of the structure. He never bothered to spend $15 to run a basic property search through the County Appraisal District website. His contempt for me blinded his judgment. He still saw me as a naive, compliant child rather than a seasoned land acquisition professional. The legal definition of a quitclaim is beautifully specific. Unlike a warranty deed, which guarantees that the seller actually owns the property free and clear, a quitclaim makes zero promises. It simply states that whatever interest the grantor might happen to hold is thereby transferred to the grantee. If you own 100% of a property, you transfer 100%. If you own nothing, you transfer nothing. When I sat at that mahogany dining table and picked up his heavy silver pen, I knew exactly what I was doing. By signing Gemma Harrison on that dotted line, I was conveying all of my personal interest in the Austin house to my sister. But Gemma Harrison possessed zero personal interest in the property. The deed was held exclusively by Lone Star Holdings, LLC. Signing that formal document was the legal equivalent of scribbling my name on a cocktail napkin and handing Savannah the Brooklyn Bridge. I surrendered nothing because I personally own nothing to surrender. This is the true power of administrative competence. My parents relied entirely on emotional manipulation. They wielded guilt, shame, and the threat of familial exile as their primary weapons. They expected me to crumble under the psychological weight of their ultimatums. They thought my calm demeanor was a sign of resignation. But you cannot guilt-trip a limited liability company. A corporate entity does not care if Savannah is pregnant. A filing number does not feel the sting of a mother's rejection. By separating my assets from my personal identity, I had built an ironclad wall between their toxic entitlement and my financial security. The conflict had permanently pivoted from a messy emotional family drama into a cold, hard reality governed by the Texas Property Code. Sitting in my car, I felt a profound sense of tranquility. The engine hummed quietly beneath me. I watched my sister press her hands against her lower back, pacing in front of the large picture window. She was mentally tearing down walls and picking out nursery colors for a structure that belonged to a corporate holding company. It was almost poetic. They had spent my entire life taking my emotional labor for granted, treating my boundaries as if they were invisible. Now they were physically trapped inside a boundary made of impenetrable legal statutes. I did not have to scream to defend my borders. I did not have to beg for my parents to recognize my worth. The beauty of the law is its total indifference to family dynamics. The law does not care who is the favorite daughter. It does not care about unborn grandchildren or whispered promises made over a roasted chicken dinner. It only cares about the chain of title. My family had brought a heavily emotional argument to an administrative battlefield. They were doomed the second they printed that document. I checked the digital clock on my dashboard. It read 9:30 in the morning. My duffel bag sat heavily in the trunk, holding the true corporate documents that dictated the reality of the situation. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the cool, air-conditioned breeze wash over my face. The anticipation was a slow, burning thrill in my chest. Meanwhile, miles away, in the concrete heat of downtown Austin, my father was undoubtedly striding into a title office. I could perfectly picture his confident, aggressive posture. He would walk up to the receptionist demanding immediate service. He would present the signed quitclaim deed with a triumphant smirk, believing he had successfully executed a brilliant familial coup. He expected the clerk to marvel at his efficiency and stamp the paper securing Savannah's future at my expense. He had no idea he was walking into an administrative guillotine. He thought he was closing a deal, but he was actually just handing a stranger a worthless piece of paper. I kept my eyes on the front door of my house, waiting for the exact moment the realization would strike. I sat in the driver's seat of my car with the air conditioning humming quietly, pushing cold air across my face. Through the large front window of my house, I could see Savannah standing in the hallway. She held a roll of blue painter's tape in one hand and a fan of pastel paint swatches in the other. She tore off small pieces of the blue tape and pressed the soft pink and pale yellow paper squares against my pristine beige walls. She stepped back, tilting her head to evaluate the colors under the recessed lighting. She was visually erasing me from the structure, one pastel square at a time. I watched her perform this territorial nesting ritual with a clinical detachment. She was decorating a mirage. While Savannah was busy claiming a hallway she did not own, my father was speeding down the interstate toward downtown Austin. I knew exactly which title company he preferred. He used their services constantly during his logistics career. He favored them because they offered complimentary espresso in heavy ceramic mugs and featured expensive leather chairs in their waiting room. Thomas is a man who equates expensive furniture with competence. He spent his entire adult life running a regional logistics empire by sheer force of personality. If a shipment was late, he shouted until a warehouse manager rerouted a truck. If a vendor challenged a contract price, he threatened to pull his business entirely. He managed his family the exact same way he managed his supply chains. Volume and intimidation were his only tools. He truly believed the world was a flexible place that would bend and yield if he simply applied enough pressure. But a title and escrow office is not a warehouse. It is a sterile, unforgiving environment governed by rigid statutory laws and administrative codes. I pictured the downtown office with its gray carpeting and frosted glass partitions. The air there always smells faintly of ozone from the large commercial printers operating constantly in the background. Desks are piled high with thick manila folders containing the dense financial histories of thousands of local properties. It is an ecosystem built entirely on verifiable facts. Emotion holds zero currency in a room where every single transaction must be backed by a clear, unbroken chain of title. My father walked through those heavy glass doors, carrying his manila envelope. He likely bypassed the leather waiting chairs and marched directly to the reception desk. He would have slid the signed quitclaim deed across the counter with a firm, decisive motion, expecting immediate compliance. He wanted to lock down his extortion before I could change my mind. He wanted the county seal stamped on that paper before noon to make his victory permanent and indisputable. The clerk behind the counter was likely a seasoned professional. Title clerks deal with hostile divorcing couples, bankrupt real estate developers, and frantic mortgage brokers every single day. They are entirely immune to bluster. The clerk took the document from my father. They read the grantor line, observing my personal signature. They read the grantee line, noting Savannah's name. Then they turned to their dual monitor setup and opened the county property tax appraisal database. Real estate transfers in Texas are a matter of public record. The database serves as a cold, impartial ledger. The clerk typed my property address into the search bar. They hit the enter key, waiting for the system to populate the ownership history. This is the precise moment the administrative gears catch and grind to a devastating halt. The computer screen refreshed, displaying the current owner of record. The name on the screen was not Gemma Harrison. The name on the screen was Lone Star Holdings, LLC. The clerk looked back at the quitclaim deed and then up at my father. They informed him calmly that there was a fundamental discrepancy. The individual who signed the document did not own the property. Therefore, the deed was defective. It could not be recorded. It conveyed nothing. I could envision the exact shade of dark red creeping up my father's neck. He would have leaned over the high counter, raising his voice. He would have told the clerk that Gemma Harrison was his daughter. He would have insisted that she lived in the house, paid the mortgage, and signed the paper willingly right in front of him just 2 nights ago. He would have demanded they process the filing immediately, citing his years of doing business with their executives. But you cannot bully a database. You cannot emotionally blackmail a county recording system into altering legal reality. The clerk maintained their professional monotone. They explained the concept of a corporate veil to my father. A private citizen cannot deed away an asset belonging to a limited liability company without explicit corporate authorization. A personal quitclaim deed has no legal bearing on a corporate asset. It does not matter who sleeps in the master bedroom. It does not matter whose clothes are in the closet. The only thing that matters is the legal entity named on the original recorded warranty deed. In commercial real estate, we rely on corporate resolutions. If a holding company wants to sell or transfer a property, the managing member must sign a specific document authorizing the transaction on behalf of the artificial entity. The signature must explicitly state their administrative title: Gemma Harrison, Managing Member. But the deed my father drafted only required my personal capacity. It was a fatal structural error. Thomas did not know the difference because Thomas never respected my career enough to understand what I actually do for a living. He thought my job merely involved looking at maps and talking to surveyors. He never grasped that my profession requires building impenetrable legal fortresses. My father was suddenly faced with a barrier he could not punch through. For 30 years, he had bulldozed his way through every obstacle using his deep voice and deep pockets. He could ground his daughters, he could fire his employees, and he could silence his wife. But he stood entirely impotent in front of a bored title clerk and a glowing computer monitor. The sheer beauty of procedure over panic is that it does not care about your feelings. The law requires a continuous, unbroken chain of ownership. My father tried to force a square peg into a round hole using nothing but his temper. The system simply rejected him. He would have demanded to speak to a manager. A senior escrow officer would have emerged from a back office only to repeat the exact same statutory facts. The quitclaim was useless. Savannah owned nothing. Lone Star Holdings LLC retained full, exclusive rights to the property. Thomas was holding a piece of paper that was legally equivalent to a child's crayon drawing. His grand strategy, his dinner table ambush, his threats of disownment, they all crashed into a rigid wall of administrative reality. The friction of that failure must have burned him from the inside out. He had no one to shout down. He could not threaten to fire the county clerk. He could not intimidate a software program. He was out of options and out of authority. I sat in my car watching Liam carry another cardboard box up my front steps. They were moving their belongings into a trap. The tension built inside the quiet cabin of my vehicle. The legal mechanism had functioned perfectly, catching my family in a snare of their own making. They were operating on stolen time, and they did not even realize the clock had already run out. I kept my eyes fixed on my front door, waiting for the inevitable moment the phone would ring and the illusion would shatter. I sat in the driver's seat of my parked car watching the scene unfold through the large front windows of my house. I could see Savannah and Liam moving through the living room. Savannah was directing Liam to shift a heavy cardboard box from the fireplace to the far wall. She was gesturing expansively, outlining her vision for a space she believed she had just inherited. I picked up my phone from the passenger seat. The screen glowed a harsh, bright white in the dim interior of the car. The digital clock in the upper corner read 10:13. I unlocked the car door and stepped out into the crushing Texas heat. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing against my skin. I left the duffel bag in the trunk. I did not need it right now. I needed to be inside the house when the reality of their situation finally breached their defenses. I walked up the limestone driveway, my heels clicking softly against the loose gravel. I climbed the wooden steps of the wraparound porch and pushed open the heavy front door. My mother, Brenda, was standing in the kitchen leaning against the quartz island. She held a glossy interior design magazine open to a spread featuring white marble countertops. She looked up as I entered. Her expression hardened instantly. "I thought you left," she said, her voice sharp and dismissive. "You should not be lingering, Gemma. It is only making this transition harder on Savannah. You need to start looking for an apartment before all the good units are leased for the fall semester." I walked past her, ignoring the provocation. I moved into the living room where Savannah was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by unrolled rugs and paint swatches. I sat down on the beige linen sofa, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. I was perfectly positioned to observe the impending collapse. The digital clock on the microwave in the kitchen shifted to 10:14. Savannah's cell phone began to ring. It was a loud, cheerful pop song echoing sharply in the high-ceilinged room. She scrambled to dig the phone out of her oversized designer purse. She glanced at the screen, and a wide, triumphant smile spread across her face. "It is Daddy," she announced, her voice trilling with excitement. "He must be at the title office. He is probably calling to tell us the deed is officially recorded." She swiped the screen to answer the call and immediately pressed the speakerphone button. She wanted the entire room to share in her victory. She placed the phone carefully on the coffee table, right next to my empty blue ceramic mug. "Hi, Daddy," she chirped, leaning forward eagerly. "Did you get it all filed? Is the house officially mine now?" The response was not a booming congratulation. The response was a heavy, suffocating silence. For 3 long seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the central air conditioning unit and the static hiss of the open phone line. The silence was so dense it felt like a physical object. Then a voice drifted through the speaker. It was not my father's voice. It was the calm, measured tone of a professional title agent speaking directly into the background of the call. "I am sorry, Mr. Harrison," the voice echoed tinny and distorted through the phone speaker, "but I must reiterate, this document is entirely void. You cannot record a personal quitclaim deed against a commercial asset. Gemma Harrison holds 0 personal interest to convey. The property is exclusively owned by Lone Star Holdings LLC. You will need a signed corporate resolution from the managing member to proceed with any transfer of title." The title agent's voice cut off abruptly, followed by the sound of a heavy breath being drawn in sharply. It was my father. The audio captured the raw, unfiltered sound of his total humiliation. He was a man who had spent 30 years bending the world to his will, and he had just collided with a wall he could not scream down. The call lasted exactly 10 seconds. Then Thomas hung up. The line went dead with a sharp final click. Savannah stared at the phone sitting on the coffee table. Her cheerful smile vanished, replaced by a mask of total confusion. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting between the dark screen of the phone and Liam's bewildered face. "What did he mean?" Savannah asked, her voice small and uncertain. "What is a corporate resolution? Why did Daddy hang up?" My mother dropped the interior design magazine onto the quartz island. The glossy pages slapped loudly against the stone. She marched into the living room, her face pale and drawn. She stared at the phone as if it had just bitten her. "Call him back," Brenda ordered, her voice trembling slightly. "Call your father back right now, Savannah. Something is wrong." Savannah snatched the phone off the table and hastily dialed the number. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. My father had turned his phone off. He was likely retreating from the title office, unable to face the clerk's pitying stares, unable to process the magnitude of his defeat. I remained seated on the beige linen sofa. I uncrossed my legs and leaned back against the cushions. I did not smile. I did not laugh. I simply sat there, radiating a cold, absolute calm. Savannah finally turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were wide with rising panic. "Gemma," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the phone. "What did that woman mean? What is Lone Star Holdings?" The illusion of their power had evaporated in 10 seconds of dead air. The entire structure of their extortion, their threats of disownment, their demands for my sanctuary was built on a foundation of profound ignorance. They had assumed I was a defenseless target. They had never considered the possibility that I possessed the administrative capability to outmaneuver them entirely. I looked at my sister. I looked at the chaotic mess of cardboard boxes and rolled rugs she had dragged into my home. Lone Star Holdings is a Texas limited liability company. I explained, my voice even and professional. It is a corporate entity registered with the Secretary of State, and it is the sole legal owner of this property. My mother's mouth fell open. She took a step back, clutching the edge of a wingback chair for support. "But you signed the deed," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We watched you sign it. You gave the house to Savannah." I shook my head slowly. "I signed exactly what Thomas drafted," I replied. "I signed a personal quitclaim conveying my personal interest. Since I do not personally own the property, I conveyed nothing. The document you forced me to sign under threat of familial exile is legally worthless." The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The air pressure seemed to drop. Liam sank down onto a cardboard box, burying his face in his hands. He understood the implications immediately. He had no house. He had a pregnant wife, a furious mother-in-law, and a pile of boxes sitting in a living room he had no right to occupy. Savannah began to hyperventilate. Short, shallow gasps tore from her throat. She gripped her stomach, rocking back and forth on her heels. "You tricked us," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You deliberately humiliated us. You knew that paper was fake and you signed it anyway." "I did not trick you, Savannah," I corrected, keeping my tone deliberately clinical. "I simply allowed you to proceed with your own flawed strategy. You demanded my home. You threatened to erase me from this family if I refused. You presented me with a legal contract and demanded a signature. I complied. It is not my fault that your legal due diligence was non-existent." The conflict had shifted completely. The emotional leverage they had weaponized against me was now entirely useless. They could not guilt me into surrendering a corporate asset. They could not disown a limited liability company. The trap had snapped shut, and they were finally feeling the teeth. Brenda lunged forward, her face contorted with rage. She raised her hand, pointing a trembling finger inches from my face. "Your father will fix this!" she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "Thomas will hire the best lawyers in Austin. He will drag you into court and prove that you defrauded us. You will not get away with this, Gemma. We will strip you of everything." I looked at her trembling finger. The desperation in her eyes was palpable. She was clinging to the illusion of my father's invincibility, even as the reality of his failure crashed down around her. You are welcome to try, I said calmly, but property law is not a subjective emotional debate, Brenda. The warranty deed is recorded with the county. The corporate filings are public record. Thomas can hire every litigator in Texas, but no judge is going to award a corporate asset to a third party based on a voided personal quitclaim. You have zero legal standing. The sound of tires screeching violently against limestone gravel echoed from outside. A heavy vehicle slammed into park directly in front of my porch. A car door slammed shut with bone-rattling force. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded up the wooden steps. The front door burst open, crashing loudly against the interior wall. My father stood in the entryway. His face was a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He held the manila envelope in his fist, crushing the thick paper in his grip. The confrontation they had initiated was about to reach its absolute breaking point. The heavy oak door bounced off the interior wall with a violent thud. Thomas stood in the entryway, blocking the morning sunlight. His chest heaved up and down. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. Sweat beaded on his forehead and soaked into the collar of his expensive polo shirt. He clutched the crushed manila envelope in his right fist. The thick legal paper inside was mangled and ruined. He glared at me with a feral intensity. He marched into the living room, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. He stopped just short of the coffee table, towering over me. "You do not own it," he bellowed. His voice shook the window panes. The sheer volume of his anger normally forced people into immediate submission. He threw the crumpled envelope onto the coffee table. It landed next to my blue ceramic mug. "You sat at my dining table and looked me in the eye and signed a piece of paper you knew was garbage." I did not flinch. I did not lean away from him. I remained perfectly still on the beige linen sofa. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked up at his flushed face and met his furious gaze without blinking. "I signed exactly what you presented to me, Thomas," I replied. My voice was steady and quiet. I used the exact same tone I reserve for hostile corporate vendors who miss their delivery deadlines. "You demanded a personal signature. You threatened to erase me from this family if I did not provide one. I complied with your demand to the letter." He slammed his fist down on the back of a nearby armchair. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight, illuminating his rage. "You deliberately deceived us," he roared. "You set a trap to humiliate your own father." I tilted my head slightly. "I did not set a trap," I stated. "I simply allowed you to proceed with a fundamentally flawed strategy. If you had spent 10 minutes conducting basic due diligence, you would have discovered the corporate ownership of this property. You chose to rely on extortion instead of a simple title search. The failure of that document is a failure of your own legal preparation. It has nothing to do with my obedience." Brenda hurried over to stand beside her husband. She gripped his arm, attempting to channel his fury. "She is a sociopath, Thomas," she hissed, glaring at me. "Look at her, sitting there. She does not even care that she is rendering her pregnant sister homeless." Savannah sobbed loudly from her spot on the floor. She gathered the scattered paint swatches, pulling them to her chest. She looked at our father with wide, pleading eyes. "Daddy, you have to fix this," she cried. "You promised me this house. Liam and I already gave notice at our apartment complex. We have nowhere else to go." Liam stood up slowly. He looked terrified. He edged toward the front door, clearly wishing he could evaporate into the Texas heat. He realized he was standing in the middle of a war zone with zero leverage and zero claim to the territory. My father ignored Liam and focused entirely on Savannah. His jaw muscle twitched. "Do not worry, sweetheart," he promised, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I am going to correct this." He turned his attention back to me. His eyes were cold and venomous. "You are going to sign the proper paperwork today, Gemma," he commanded. "You are going to call whoever you need to call and generate a corporate resolution. We are going back to that title office and you are going to transfer the deed legally. If you refuse, I will hire a team of litigators to bury you. I will sue you for fraud. I will drag your holding company into court and drain every single dollar you possess in legal fees." This was the climax of his tactical playbook. Throughout his logistics career, he crushed smaller competitors by burying them in expensive litigation. He believed his wealth could buy my compliance through sheer financial terror. He expected me to pale at the threat of a lawsuit. He anticipated my immediate surrender. I felt my pulse slow down. My mind processed his threat with surgical precision. The clash of energies in the room was absolute. His frantic, chaotic rage battered against my measured silence like ocean waves breaking against a seawall. Bullies rely entirely on fear to maintain their authority. They expect their target to panic, to apologize, to scramble for a compromise. When that fear is entirely absent, their entire strategy unravels. I looked at the crumpled envelope on the coffee table. I looked at my father. "You cannot sue me for fraud, Thomas," I explained patiently. "Fraud requires a false representation of fact intended to deceive. I never claimed to own this house personally. You made an assumption. I never offered you a warranty deed guaranteeing clear title. You forced a quitclaim deed upon me. A quitclaim explicitly transfers only the interest I personally hold, which happens to be nothing. No judge in Travis County will entertain a lawsuit based on your failure to read a public record." His face turned a deeper shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin. "You are my daughter," he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. "You owe us your respect." I shook my head slowly. "The biological accident of my birth does not supersede Texas property law," I replied. "You traded away your right to play the father card the moment you threatened to disown me over a piece of real estate. You cannot demand filial loyalty while simultaneously treating me like a disposable asset." The room went completely silent. The only sound was Savannah's ragged breathing. My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. He was searching for a weapon he could use. He had exhausted his threats. He had exhausted his volume. He was standing in a living room he did not own, demanding a prize he could not take. Brenda stepped forward again, her face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You think you are so clever," she spat. "You think you can just sit there and gloat while your family suffers? But you are alone, Gemma. You have always been alone. No one will ever love a woman this cold." Her words were designed to pierce my armor. She was reaching for the oldest insecurity I harbored, the fear that my independence made me unlovable. But the insult landed harmlessly against the ironclad wall I had built. I realized her definition of love was synonymous with submission. If being loved meant setting myself on fire to keep Savannah warm, I preferred the cold. I picked up my blue ceramic mug. The coffee inside was tepid, but I took a slow sip anyway. The action was deliberate. It communicated a total lack of urgency. It demonstrated that their hysteria held zero power over my physical space. I set the mug down on the glass table. I looked at the three of them grouped together in the center of my sanctuary. They looked small. They looked pathetic. The illusion of their superiority had shattered, leaving behind a group of desperate, entitled people who had never learned how to earn their own success. Thomas stepped closer to the sofa. He raised his hand, hovering it near his shoulder. For a fleeting second, I thought he might attempt physical intimidation. He was a large man, accustomed to looming over subordinates. But he hesitated. He saw the cold, empty calculation in my eyes. He realized that if he crossed that physical boundary, I would not cower. I would simply dial the authorities and watch him be arrested for assaulting a corporate officer on company property. He lowered his hand. His chest deflated slightly. "You are a monster," he whispered. "I am a land acquisition manager," I corrected him, "and I am currently dealing with an unauthorized intrusion on commercial property." Savannah scrambled to her feet. She grabbed Liam's arm, pulling him away from the front door. "We have to leave," she cried hysterically. "She is going to call the police on us. We have to get out of here." Liam looked relieved. He reached for one of the smaller cardboard boxes resting near the fireplace. "Leave the box," Thomas snapped at Liam. "We are not retreating. We are going to figure this out. We are not letting her win." My father turned his back on me and began pacing across the hardwood floor. He was muttering under his breath, running his hands through his thinning hair. He was desperately trying to calculate a new angle, a new loophole. He was searching for a way to override the corporate structure that stood between him and his prize. I watched him pace. The conflict was evolving. They were refusing to accept the reality of the situation. They believed they could occupy the space until they formulated a new plan of attack. They thought their physical presence in my living room granted them a form of leverage. They assumed I would eventually tire of the standoff and offer a compromise just to clear the air. They did not understand that a limited liability company does not compromise with trespassers. I had allowed them to exhaust their emotional ammunition. I had watched their extortion collapse under the weight of statutory law. Now it was time to transition from defensive maneuvering to offensive action. It was time to formalize their eviction. I reached toward my leather briefcase sitting on the floor beside the sofa. The final administrative blow was waiting inside a crisp manila folder, ready to sever their entitlement forever. My father paced across the hardwood floor, his heavy footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged room. He muttered furiously under his breath, analyzing angles and searching for a loophole that did not exist. Savannah sobbed into Liam's shoulder, her tears staining his shirt as she mourned a nursery she had never actually owned. My mother stood rigidly near the fireplace, staring at me with a mixture of loathing and shock. The living room felt small, suffocated by their panic and their refusal to accept reality. They were waiting for me to break. They expected the tension to wear me down, assuming I would eventually offer a compromise just to clear the toxic air from my home. They did not understand that I was entirely comfortable in the silence. My career requires patience. I negotiate land acquisitions with developers who scream, threaten, and storm out of conference rooms. You win those battles by simply sitting still and waiting for the tantrum to end. I watched my family exhaust themselves, observing their panic with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a chemical reaction burn itself out. Savannah finally pulled her face away from Liam's shoulder. Her makeup was smeared, tracing dark lines down her cheeks. She looked at me, her eyes wide and desperate. "Gemma," she pleaded, her voice cracking, "what does this mean for my nursery? We already ordered the crib. It is being delivered next week. Where am I going to put it?" I did not answer her directly. Her inability to grasp the situation was profound. She was still operating under the delusion that her pregnancy entitled her to my property, despite the crushing legal reality that had just been exposed. She thought tears could override a corporate charter. I uncrossed my legs and stood up from the beige linen sofa. I walked deliberately over to my leather briefcase resting on the floor. I crouched down and unbuckled the straps. The sharp snap of the metal fasteners cut through the heavy silence in the room. My family watched me, their eyes tracking my every movement. They were hoping I was reaching for my checkbook, or perhaps a different legal form to magically fix the disaster they had created. Instead, I pulled out a crisp, pristine manila folder. It was entirely unmarked, distinct from the crumpled mess my father had thrown onto the coffee table. This folder did not contain a useless downloaded quitclaim template. It contained a document drafted by a seasoned commercial attorney, the registered agent for Lone Star Holdings, LLC. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. The sound of my heels clicking against the floorboards sounded like a countdown. I stopped at the large quartz island. My mother flinched slightly as I approached, taking a half step backward. I placed the manila folder on the cold white stone. I opened the cover, revealing a single sheet of heavy bond paper. The black ink was sharp and authoritative. "This is a formal 3-day notice to vacate for trespassing," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the open concept space. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. The conflict had officially transitioned. I was no longer speaking to them as a disappointed daughter or an older sister. I was speaking to them as the authorized managing member of a corporate entity protecting its commercial asset. I placed my index finger on the top of the crisp white paper and slid it across the smooth quartz counter. The document made a soft, decisive swishing sound as it traveled. It stopped right in front of Savannah and Liam, the bold, black text glaring up at them. "The corporate entity that owns this home has not authorized your tenancy," I explained, maintaining strict eye contact with Liam, recognizing that he was the only one capable of actually processing the logistics of their eviction. "You have 72 hours to remove your belongings from this property. If these boxes and rugs are not gone by Monday morning, I will contact the county sheriff. They will escort you off the premises and your possessions will be impounded at your expense." Liam stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. He read the header, "Notice to Vacate." He read the names Savannah Harrison and Liam Miller. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He finally understood the absolute gravity of the situation. They were not engaged in a family spat. They were facing immediate legal action. Savannah let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She reached for the paper, her hands trembling so violently the document shook in her grip. "You are evicting us?" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical register. "I am carrying your niece and you are throwing me out on the street?" I did not flinch. "You are not a tenant, Savannah," I corrected her smoothly. "You never signed a lease, you never paid a security deposit, you simply backed a moving truck into a driveway you do not own and started taping paint swatches to a wall. That is the legal definition of trespassing. The 3-day notice is a courtesy. The corporation could have demanded immediate removal." My father stopped pacing. He stared at the notice to vacate, his face transitioning from red to a sickly pale gray. The reality of his failure was finally setting in. He could not yell a corporate eviction notice out of existence. He could not intimidate a sheriff's deputy executing a lawful order. His money and his volume were entirely useless against the grinding machinery of Texas property law. Brenda slammed her hands down on the quartz island. The sharp crack echoed through the kitchen. "You are a monster, Gemma," she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. She leaned over the counter, her eyes wide and unhinged. "This is your sister. How can you be this cruel? How can you look at her pregnant belly and hand her an eviction notice?" I looked at my mother, noting the frantic, erratic energy radiating from her. She was exhibiting classic signs of an extinction burst. When manipulative individuals realize their control is completely broken, they escalate their behavior dramatically. They scream louder, hurl worse insults, and display exaggerated victimhood in a desperate attempt to force compliance. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I leaned against the counter and simply watched her. It is a technique I learned from observing medical professionals handle combative patients. You do not argue with the delusion, you simply wait for the patient to exhaust their adrenaline. "My cruelty is a mirror, Brenda," I replied quietly. "You demanded I surrender my sanctuary under threat of total familial abandonment. You tried to steal a $750,000 asset because you deemed Savannah more worthy of comfort. You orchestrated an ambush at your dining table and handed me an ultimatum. I am simply holding you accountable to the consequences of your own extortion." My father pointed a shaking finger at me. "I will ruin you for this," he growled, his voice thick with malice. "I will hire a team of lawyers. We will sue you for fraud. We will tie this property up in litigation for a decade. You will never see a dime of equity when we are finished with you." I picked up the blue ceramic mug from the coffee table earlier and brought it to the sink. I turned on the faucet, carefully rinsing the remaining coffee down the drain. I enjoyed the sound of the running water, a soothing contrast to his chaotic threats. "You cannot sue for fraud, Thomas," I reminded him patiently, drying my hands on a soft cotton towel. "I explained this 20 minutes ago. Fraud requires deception. I signed the exact personal quitclaim deed you presented to me. I never claimed to hold personal title. You simply failed to verify the ownership. You cannot sue me because you were too arrogant to perform a basic public records search. No attorney will take that case on contingency, and you will bleed thousands in hourly fees just to have a judge throw it out with prejudice." The silence that followed was absolute. My father stared at me, his jaw working silently, as he searched for a counterattack that did not exist. Savannah wept loudly, burying her face in Liam's chest. My mother stood paralyzed, her hands gripping the edge of the quartz island. The ultimate escalation had occurred, and they were left completely defenseless against the cold, hard administration of justice. The architecture of my home features towering vaulted ceilings designed to capture the morning sunlight and distribute it evenly across the hardwood floors. Today, those high ceilings served a very different purpose. They acted as a giant acoustic amplifier, bouncing my mother's frantic shrieking back down upon us. The sound echoed off the bare walls and magnified the sheer chaos unfolding in my living room. I leaned my lower back against the cool edge of the quartz kitchen island. I crossed my ankles and rested my hands lightly on the edge of the stone. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not open my mouth to argue. I simply became a silent, immovable object in the center of their raging storm. In behavioral psychology, there is a specific term for what I was witnessing. It is called an extinction burst. When a subject is conditioned to receive a reward for a certain behavior, they learn to expect that outcome. If you suddenly remove the reward, the subject does not just quietly accept the change and walk away. They escalate. They push the lever harder, faster, and louder. They throw their entire physical and emotional weight into the action, hoping that a sudden burst of intensity will force the broken machine to dispense the prize one last time. My family had spent decades pressing the guilt lever, expecting my immediate submission. Now that the machine was unplugged, they were losing their minds. Brenda paced in jagged, erratic circles near the fireplace, her carefully maintained facade of maternal grace shattered into a million sharp pieces. She hurled insults with the precision of a practiced sniper aiming for every vulnerability she thought I still harbored. "You are a monster, Gemma," she shrieked, her voice scraping raw against her throat. Her face flushed a mottled dark pink, and the tendons in her neck strained against her skin. She pointed a trembling finger toward Savannah, who was still weeping on the floor. "Look at what you are doing. You are putting a pregnant woman on the street. You are kicking your own unborn niece out into the cold because you are a jealous, bitter spinster who cannot stand to see anyone else happy." Her words were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. She wanted me to feel a crushing sense of shame. She wanted me to internalize the narrative that protecting my own property was an act of unforgivable cruelty. But her insults felt weightless. They drifted through the air and landed harmlessly on the floor next to the boxes of nursery decor. I looked at her twisted features and felt nothing but a profound sense of clinical pity. I watched her the way a seasoned emergency room physician watches a combative patient under a psychiatric hold. When someone is trapped in the grip of a hysterical delusion, you do not debate them. You do not try to inject logic into a mind that is currently running purely on panicked adrenaline. You step back, secure your borders, and let them scream until their vocal cords give out. Thomas realized his wife's emotional terrorism was failing to provoke a reaction. He decided to switch tactics, reverting to the only other weapon in his arsenal: intimidation. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket, jabbing his thick finger against the screen. He held the device up like a physical shield. "I am calling my legal team right now," he threatened, spit flying from his lips and landing on the pristine oak floorboards. "You think you are so smart with your little holding company. You think you found a clever loophole. I am going to have you deposed by Friday. We will file an emergency injunction to halt this eviction. We will sue you for fraudulent inducement and intentional infliction of emotional distress. By the time my lawyers are finished dissecting your life, you will have to sell this house just to cover your own defense costs." He was shouting legal buzzwords he had gleaned from television procedurals and corporate boardroom disputes. He strung the terms together in a nonsensical word salad, hoping the sheer volume of his voice would terrify me into reversing the eviction. Fraudulent inducement requires a promise made with the intent to deceive. I made no promises. An emergency injunction requires a demonstration of irreparable harm and a likelihood of success on the merits. He possessed neither. He was an emperor standing naked in my living room, demanding I compliment his tailored suit. I maintained my silence. Silence is a remarkable tool during an extinction burst. It acts as a vacuum. The more they shouted into the void, the more oxygen they consumed. Their arguments cannibalized each other. Brenda wailed about family loyalty, while Thomas threatened to bankrupt me. Savannah sobbed about her vintage crib, while Liam stared at the front door, measuring the distance to his escape route. They were a chaotic, tangled mess of entitlement and greed laid bare under the bright Texas sun. The absurdity of their position was staggering. I let my eyes wander around the physical space of the living room. Liam had stacked 3 heavy cardboard boxes near the hearth. Savannah had unrolled a plush, cream-colored rug across the center of the floor. Blue painter's tape marked the walls where she planned to hang curtains she had not yet purchased. They brought a moving truck to a property they did not own. They planned extensive renovations based on a document they forced me to sign under extreme duress. Now they were attempting to play the victim. They wanted the world to believe I was the villain for refusing to let them steal my sanctuary. Abusers always weaponize their victimhood when they are finally held accountable to a firm boundary. They frame your self-respect as an unprovoked attack. If you stop handing them your resources, they accuse you of theft. If you lock your front door, they accuse you of imprisonment. Brenda clutched her chest, gasping for air, as if my silent presence were physically suffocating her. She leaned heavily against the wingback chair, playing the role of the devastated matriarch to perfection. "How can you do this?" she gasped, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "How can you throw your own blood away for a pile of bricks?" She repeated the phrase as if it were an incantation that might magically restore her power. A pile of bricks. That was all my hard work meant to her. The years of studying, the late nights drafting proposals, the disciplined saving, the careful negotiations. It was just a pile of bricks standing in the way of Savannah's comfort. Thomas ended his fake phone call noticing that I had not even blinked at his legal threats. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his hands trembling with unspent rage. He marched toward the kitchen island, stopping just 3 feet away from me. He leaned forward, trying to use his height to cast a shadow over my face. "You are going to regret this, Gemma," he growled. "You are going to wake up one day in this giant empty house and realize you have no one. You will have your paperwork and your corporate entities, but you will be entirely alone. And when that day comes, do not you dare reach out to us. We are done with you." He delivered the threat of abandonment, assuming it was the ultimate punishment. He thought my greatest fear was losing my seat at their table. He did not understand that I had already walked away from that table the moment they demanded I serve myself up as the main course. I kept my back pressed against the cool quartz. I matched his furious stare with a calm, steady gaze. I could see the tiny broken blood vessels around his nose. I could smell the stale coffee and nervous sweat radiating from his skin. The frantic energy in the room was finally beginning to crest. The extinction burst had reached its peak and gravity was starting to pull their adrenaline back down to earth. Their shoulders slumped slightly. The volume of their shouting decreased. The frantic pacing slowed to a hesitant shuffle. They were running out of breath and running out of ammunition. They had thrown every emotional and psychological weapon they possessed at my ironclad wall, and the wall had not even scratched. The silence returned to the living room, slowly filling the spaces between their ragged breaths. They were waiting for me to speak. They were waiting for me to provide them with a lifeline, a compromise, a sliver of hope they could cling to. I prepared to deliver the final blow that would sever their connection to my property forever. The echoes of their furious shouting finally faded into the high vaulted ceiling. The living room settled into a heavy, stagnant quiet. It was the kind of silence that follows a destructive storm, leaving only wreckage behind. Brenda stood by the fireplace, panting softly. Her chest rose and fell in jagged, uneven rhythms. Thomas remained frozen near the kitchen island. His face had shifted from a dangerous crimson to a pale, sickly gray. He looked like an engine that had burned through its fuel supply, leaving nothing but smoking gears. Savannah wiped her nose with the back of her hand, whimpering softly against Liam's shoulder. Liam stared at the floorboards, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. They were entirely out of breath. Their emotional artillery was depleted. They stood in the center of my sanctuary, waiting for a response that would validate their outrage. They expected me to offer a concession. They anticipated a tearful apology or a desperate plea to keep my place at their holiday table. Instead, they received the cold, unyielding gaze of a woman who had just severed their strings. I stepped away from the quartz counter. My movements were slow and deliberate. I did not rush. I wanted them to feel the distinct shift in the atmosphere. The space between us was no longer a familial living room. It had transformed into a negotiation table where I held every single card. I looked at my father, watching the way his broad shoulders slumped forward. The imposing, authoritarian figure who had governed my childhood was suddenly reduced to a tired, desperate man trespassing on corporate territory. For 10 years, I had functioned as the silent shock absorber for this family. When Savannah totaled her first car, I was the one who quietly paid the insurance deductible so Thomas would not cancel her college tuition. When Brenda overspent on a lavish European vacation, I discreetly covered 2 months of their utility bills to prevent the lights from shutting off. I carried their financial and emotional burdens, assuming it was the rent required to occupy a space in their lives. I thought my utility would eventually earn their respect. I believed my competence would eventually secure their love. Standing in the bright Texas sunlight streaming through my picture windows, I experienced a profound internal epiphany. The threat Thomas issued during that dining room ambush was not a death sentence. He told me I would be disowned. He told me I would be forgotten by the end of the week. He wielded familial exile as the ultimate punishment, expecting the prospect of isolation to shatter my resolve. He was profoundly mistaken. Disownment was not a penalty. It was an offer of unconditional freedom. The realization washed over me, washing away decades of ingrained guilt. I did not need to earn my seat at their table anymore because I owned the entire dining room. I did not need their conditional affection because I had built a life that required no external validation. They had handed me the exact key I needed to unlock my own cage. By declaring me an outcast, they legally and morally absolved me of any future obligations toward their survival. I focused my attention squarely on Thomas. I kept my voice incredibly level, ensuring every syllable carved its way into the quiet room. "This is Texas Dad," I said. My tone carried the crisp, authoritative cadence I utilize when closing a high-stakes land acquisition. Property rights are not casual suggestions. They are the foundational bedrock of this state. You cannot bluff your way onto a deed. You cannot bully a county clerk into transferring a title. And you certainly cannot steal a corporate asset using a forged emotional narrative. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His throat worked silently, swallowing dry air. The realization of his profound failure was paralyzing him. "You sat at your mahogany table and threatened to disown me," I continued, my words slicing through the stagnant air. "You tried to exile me from a family I have been financially and emotionally carrying for a full decade. You thought removing your approval would break me, but you fundamentally misunderstood the leverage in our relationship. You can banish me from your holiday dinners, you can erase my name from your will, but you cannot disown me from an asset I administratively control." I took a slow step forward, bridging the gap between the kitchen and the living room. Brenda shrank back, pressing her shoulders against the mantel. Savannah stopped whimpering, holding her breath as my shadow fell across her unrolled rugs. "You came into my sanctuary intending to strip me of everything I earned," I stated. "You assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness. You thought my reluctance to argue meant I was preparing to surrender. You failed to recognize that I was simply waiting for you to walk far enough into the snare so you could never back out." I looked at the four of them, memorizing the exact expressions of defeat etched across their faces. The power dynamics in the room had permanently inverted. The parents, who had always viewed me as a compliant secondary character, were suddenly staring at a formidable adult. They saw the corporate executive who orchestrated multi-million-dollar deals. They saw the land acquisition manager who routinely dismantled hostile developers. They realized they were no longer dealing with a daughter seeking their validation. They were facing a strategist who had entirely outplayed them on every conceivable level. The paradigm shift was visible in their physical postures. Brenda's theatrical outrage evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified stare. Savannah's entitled demands dissolved into a whimpering realization that her pristine nursery was never going to materialize. Liam's nervous shifting ceased, replaced by a rigid, fearful anticipation of his next instructions. And Thomas, the proud, stubborn patriarch, stared at the floorboards, unable to look his conqueror in the eye. I raised my right arm, extending my index finger toward the heavy oak front door. The brass doorknob gleamed in the sunlight. "The corporate entity that owns this structure does not recognize your presence," I declared. "The legal notice on that counter gives you 72 hours, but my personal tolerance for your trespassing expired the moment you walked through that doorway." I locked eyes with Thomas, forcing him to meet my gaze. The finality in my voice left zero room for interpretation. "Take your boxes," I commanded. "Pack up your paint swatches, gather your things, and get out of my house." The directive hung in the air, sharp and uncompromising. I did not yell. I did not curse. The raw authority in my voice was more devastating than any screamed insult could ever be. I had drawn the ultimate line in the sand. I was defending my Alamo without firing a single shot. The battle was over. The invaders were routed. Now I just needed to watch them execute their own humiliating retreat. I lowered my arm and stood firmly in the center of the hardwood floor. I was a sovereign citizen standing on sovereign soil. The toxic tether that had bound me to their approval was officially severed. The silence stretched again, but this time it was not tense or frantic. It was the sound of a definitive victory. I waited for the physical reality of my command to penetrate their shock. I watched Liam slowly bend down and wrap his hands around the edges of a cardboard box, preparing to initiate the withdrawal. Liam bent down toward the hearth. His heavy work boots scuffed against my polished oak floorboards. He gripped the reinforced edges of the large cardboard box containing the nursery decor. He lifted it with a deep, strained grunt. Savannah wrapped both of her arms tightly around her stomach. She watched her husband carry their stolen future toward the front door. She let out a sharp, ragged sob.
"Liam," she wailed, "get the rest of it! Just get it out of here right now!"
Her voice lacked its usual commanding pitch. It was a hollow, defeated sound, echoing poorly in the vaulted space. Liam did not pause to comfort her. He did not offer a reassuring smile or a gentle word. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the threshold. He walked through the entryway and pushed the heavy oak door open with his shoulder. The humid Texas air rushed inside, replacing the sterile, chilled air conditioning. I listened to the blunt thud of the box being dropped onto the porch planks. It was the distinct, unceremonious sound of an invasion collapsing. Savannah knelt on the hardwood floor. Her hands moved erratically over the unrolled cream-colored rug. She scrambled to gather the scattered pastel paint swatches she had proudly displayed mere minutes ago. She reached up and peeled the blue painter's tape off my beige walls. Each piece came away with a faint, crisp tearing noise. A week ago, she would have demanded I assist her. She would have expected me to cater to her pregnancy and manage the physical labor on her behalf. Today, she did not even dare look in my direction. She crammed the swatches and the tape into her oversized designer purse. She moved like a thief caught in the act, hastily stuffing her pockets before the authorities arrived. Watching her dismantle her own entitlement was a profound exercise in quiet justice. The structural hierarchy of our childhood was crumbling right in front of my eyes. The golden child was packing up her unearned prizes and preparing to exit through the back door. My father, Thomas, turned away from the kitchen island. He looked significantly older than he had when he first breached my doorway. The imposing posture that defined his entire executive career had vanished. His shoulders sagged, pulling his tailored polo shirt out of alignment. He walked past me without speaking. The crushed manila envelope remained on my coffee table, a permanent monument to his failure. He did not retrieve it. He did not want to touch the physical evidence of his humiliation. He stepped onto the porch and walked down the limestone driveway. His expensive leather shoes crunched rhythmically over the loose gravel. He climbed into his polished SUV and pulled the heavy door shut, sealing himself inside his own defeat. He stared straight through the windshield, refusing to cast a single glance back at the property he failed to conquer. Brenda was the last to move. She lingered near the fireplace. Her eyes darted around the high-ceilinged living room, searching for a remaining foothold. She reached out and picked up the framed ultrasound photo she had centered so carefully on my mantel. She held the silver frame against her chest like a protective shield. She walked slowly toward the entryway. Her heels clicked a hesitant, irregular beat against the floorboards. She stopped right at the threshold. The bright afternoon sunlight illuminated the fine lines around her eyes and mouth. The theatrical rage had burned away, leaving a raw, desperate sorrow. She turned to face me one final time. Genuine tears spilled over her lower lashes, cutting wet tracks through her pristine makeup. She looked at me, not with anger, but with a profound, uncomprehending grief. "How could you do this to us, Gemma?" she whispered. Her voice carried a fragile tremor. "How could you be so cold to your own family?" She was deploying the final weapon in the manipulator's arsenal, the guilt trip. When volume and threats fail, they attempt to make you responsible for their pain. They twist the narrative, casting your self-defense as an unprovoked attack. She wanted me to carry the burden of her disappointment. She wanted me to apologize for locking my own doors. I stood in the center of the living room. I did not step forward to comfort her. I did not offer a soft smile to cushion the blow. I met her tearful gaze with perfect clarity. "I gave you exactly what you asked for, Brenda," I replied. My voice was calm and measured, devoid of any malice or regret. "I gave you ink on a page. The rest is just business." She stared at me for a long moment, processing the cold, indisputable truth of my statement. I was not playing her game anymore. The emotional currency she relied upon held zero value here. She tightened her grip on the silver frame, turned her back, and walked out the door. I followed her at a safe distance, stopping on the front porch. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing. The summer heat enveloped me instantly, but it felt cleansing rather than oppressive. I watched Liam load the final cardboard box into the back of the rented moving truck. He pulled the heavy metal roll-up door down, securing a padlock into place. The loud metallic clatter echoed across the quiet hill country landscape. Savannah climbed into the passenger seat of their dented sedan, slamming the door shut. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the house she almost stole. Liam climbed into the driver's seat of the moving truck and turned the key. The diesel motor coughed and roared to life, expelling a thick cloud of dark exhaust into the clear air. The engine noise drowned out the cicadas humming in the cedar trees. My father's SUV was already backing down the long driveway. The tires spun slightly, kicking up a spray of white dust. Liam shifted the moving truck into reverse. The warning beep sounded in a steady mechanical rhythm, echoing a rhythmic retreat. I stood on the porch and observed the procession. The silver sedan followed the moving truck. The taillights glowed bright red against the dusty driveway. They rolled past the property line, turning onto the main asphalt road. The vehicles accelerated, merging into the afternoon traffic. Within 60 seconds, they were gone. The sudden absence of their chaotic energy was staggering. The diesel rumble faded into the distance, replaced once again by the natural sounds of the Texas landscape. A warm breeze rustled through the branches of the old cedar trees. A hawk circled high above the limestone hills, casting a fleeting shadow over the native grass. I exhaled. The breath left my lungs in a long, slow stream, carrying a decade of tension along with it. My shoulders dropped. The rigid posture I maintained throughout the siege softened. My sanctuary belonged to me again. I turned and walked back inside the house. I closed the heavy oak door, pushing the deadbolt into place with a satisfying, solid click. I walked through the quiet, empty living room. The faint scuff marks on the floorboards and the residual outline of blue painter's tape on the wall were the only physical reminders of the attempted invasion. I picked up the crushed manila envelope from the coffee table. I carried it into the kitchen and dropped it into the recycling bin right on top of the pastel nursery catalog. The administrative trap had functioned perfectly. The corporate structure held firm, protecting my assets from a relentless emotional assault. I walked over to the quartz island and picked up my blue ceramic mug. I carried it to the sink, washing it with warm water and soap. The simple domestic task grounded me. I was safe. I was secure. I had successfully defended my borders. But as I dried my hands on a soft cotton towel, a cold, analytical thought surfaced in my mind. The physical invasion was over. The moving truck was gone. The quitclaim deed was void. But people like Brenda and Thomas do not simply retreat and accept defeat. When manipulators are denied a physical prize, they seek compensation through social currency. They require an audience to validate their victimhood. They had lost the real estate battle. I knew with perfect certainty they would now shift their focus to a different battlefield. They would attempt to rewrite the narrative. They would construct a story where I was the ruthless villain and they were the innocent victims. They would weaponize the only domain they still controlled, public perception. My phone, sitting on the passenger seat of my car, was about to become the next front line. Families built on optics always demand a spectacle. I finished folding the towel, preparing myself for the inevitable digital fallout. Liam bent down toward the hearth. His heavy work boots scuffed against my polished oak floorboards. He gripped the reinforced edges of the large cardboard box containing the nursery decor. He lifted it with a deep, strained grunt. Savannah wrapped both of her arms tightly around her stomach. She watched her husband carry their stolen future toward the front door. She let out a sharp, ragged sob.
Liam, she wailed, get the rest of it. Just get it out of here right now.
Her voice lacked its usual commanding pitch. It was a hollow, defeated sound, echoing poorly in the vaulted space. Liam did not pause to comfort her. He did not offer a reassuring smile or a gentle word. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the threshold. He walked through the entryway and pushed the heavy oak door open with his shoulder. The humid Texas air rushed inside, replacing the sterile, chilled air conditioning. I listened to the blunt thud of the box being dropped onto the porch planks. It was the distinct, unceremonious sound of an invasion collapsing. Savannah knelt on the hardwood floor. Her hands moved erratically over the unrolled cream-colored rug. She scrambled to gather the scattered pastel paint swatches she had proudly displayed mere minutes ago. She reached up and peeled the blue painter's tape off my beige walls. Each piece came away with a faint, crisp, tearing noise. A week ago, she would have demanded I assist her. She would have expected me to cater to her pregnancy and manage the physical labor on her behalf. Today, she did not even dare look in my direction. She crammed the swatches and the tape into her oversized designer purse. She moved like a thief caught in the act, hastily stuffing her pockets before the authorities arrived. Watching her dismantle her own entitlement was a profound exercise in quiet justice. The structural hierarchy of our childhood was crumbling right in front of my eyes. The golden child was packing up her unearned prizes and preparing to exit through the back door. My father Thomas turned away from the kitchen island. He looked significantly older than he had when he first breached my doorway. The imposing posture that defined his entire executive career had vanished. His shoulders sagged, pulling his tailored polo shirt out of alignment. He walked past me without speaking. The crushed manila envelope remained on my coffee table, a permanent monument to his failure. He did not retrieve it. He did not want to touch the physical evidence of his humiliation. He stepped onto the porch and walked down the limestone driveway. His expensive leather shoes crunched rhythmically over the loose gravel. He climbed into his polished SUV and pulled the heavy door shut, sealing himself inside his own defeat. He stared straight through the windshield, refusing to cast a single glance back at the property he failed to conquer. Brenda was the last to move. She lingered near the fireplace. Her eyes darted around the high-ceilinged living room, searching for a remaining foothold. She reached out and picked up the framed ultrasound photo she had centered so carefully on my mantel. She held the silver frame against her chest like a protective shield. She walked slowly toward the entryway. Her heels clicked a hesitant, irregular beat against the floorboards. She stopped right at the threshold. The bright afternoon sunlight illuminated the fine lines around her eyes and mouth. The theatrical rage had burned away, leaving a raw, desperate sorrow. She turned to face me one final time. Genuine tears spilled over her lower lashes, cutting wet tracks through her pristine makeup. She looked at me, not with anger, but with a profound, uncomprehending grief. "How could you do this to us, Gemma?" she whispered. Her voice carried a fragile tremor. "How could you be so cold to your own family?" She was deploying the final weapon in the manipulator's arsenal, the guilt trip. When volume and threats fail, they attempt to make you responsible for their pain. They twist the narrative, casting your self-defense as an unprovoked attack. She wanted me to carry the burden of her disappointment. She wanted me to apologize for locking my own doors. I stood in the center of the living room. I did not step forward to comfort her. I did not offer a soft smile to cushion the blow. I met her tearful gaze with perfect clarity. "I gave you exactly what you asked for, Brenda," I replied. My voice was calm and measured, devoid of any malice or regret. "I gave you ink on a page. The rest is just business." She stared at me for a long moment, processing the cold, indisputable truth of my statement. I was not playing her game anymore. The emotional currency she relied upon held zero value here. She tightened her grip on the silver frame, turned her back, and walked out the door. I followed her at a safe distance, stopping on the front porch. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing. The summer heat enveloped me instantly, but it felt cleansing rather than oppressive. I watched Liam load the final cardboard box into the back of the rented moving truck. He pulled the heavy metal roll-up door down, securing a padlock into place. The loud metallic clatter echoed across the quiet hill country landscape. Savannah climbed into the passenger seat of their dented sedan, slamming the door shut. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the house she almost stole. Liam climbed into the driver's seat of the moving truck and turned the key. The diesel motor coughed and roared to life, expelling a thick cloud of dark exhaust into the clear air. The engine noise drowned out the cicadas humming in the cedar trees. My father's SUV was already backing down the long driveway. The tires spun slightly, kicking up a spray of white dust. Liam shifted the moving truck into reverse. The warning beep sounded in a steady mechanical rhythm, echoing a rhythmic retreat. I stood on the porch and observed the procession. The silver sedan followed the moving truck. The taillights glowed bright red against the dusty driveway. They rolled past the property line, turning onto the main asphalt road. The vehicles accelerated, merging into the afternoon traffic. Within 60 seconds, they were gone. The sudden absence of their chaotic energy was staggering. The diesel rumble faded into the distance, replaced once again by the natural sounds of the Texas landscape. A warm breeze rustled through the branches of the old cedar trees. A hawk circled high above the limestone hills, casting a fleeting shadow over the native grass. I exhaled. The breath left my lungs in a long, slow stream, carrying a decade of tension along with it. My shoulders dropped. The rigid posture I maintained throughout the siege softened. My sanctuary belonged to me again. I turned and walked back inside the house. I closed the heavy oak door, pushing the deadbolt into place with a satisfying, solid click. I walked through the quiet, empty living room. The faint scuff marks on the floorboards and the residual outline of blue painter's tape on the wall were the only physical reminders of the attempted invasion. I picked up the crushed manila envelope from the coffee table. I carried it into the kitchen and dropped it into the recycling bin right on top of the pastel nursery catalog. The administrative trap had functioned perfectly. The corporate structure held firm, protecting my assets from a relentless emotional assault. I walked over to the quartz island and picked up my blue ceramic mug. I carried it to the sink, washing it with warm water and soap. The simple domestic task grounded me. I was safe. I was secure. I had successfully defended my borders. But as I dried my hands on a soft cotton towel, a cold, analytical thought surfaced in my mind. The physical invasion was over. The moving truck was gone. The quick claim deed was void. But people like Brenda and Thomas do not simply retreat and accept defeat. When manipulators are denied a physical prize, they seek compensation through social currency. They require an audience to validate their victimhood. They had lost the real estate battle. I knew with perfect certainty they would now shift their focus to a different battlefield. They would attempt to rewrite the narrative. They would construct a story where I was the ruthless villain and they were the innocent victims. They would weaponize the only domain they still controlled: public perception. My phone, sitting on the passenger seat of my car, was about to become the next front line. Families built on optics always demand a spectacle. I finished folding the towel, preparing myself for the inevitable digital fallout. The physical occupation of my property ended on a Friday afternoon. The digital occupation began exactly 3 hours later. Families constructed entirely on the foundation of public optics cannot simply retreat and process a loss privately. They require an audience. They demand a stage where they can perform their victimhood and solicit validation from a network of extended relatives and casual acquaintances. I was sitting in my quiet kitchen holding my blue ceramic mug when my phone screen illuminated. It was a notification from the family group chat. The thread had been dormant for days. Now it was suddenly vibrant with activity. I did not open the application immediately. I took a sip of my coffee, anticipating the exact angle of their assault. Brenda fired the opening salvo on her public social media page. I knew this because a well-meaning but incredibly nosy aunt instantly forwarded a screenshot to my personal number. My mother had posted a highly edited photograph of Savannah standing next to a stack of packed cardboard boxes. Savannah was looking down, resting both hands protectively over her stomach, presenting a picture of absolute devastation. The caption below the photo was a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. My mother wrote about the heartbreak of discovering that certain family members possess hearts made of stone. She detailed the trauma of watching a pregnant woman being forced out into the unforgiving streets without explicitly naming the perpetrator. She asked her followers for prayers and strength during this season of unimaginable betrayal. The post was designed to ignite a firestorm, and it succeeded brilliantly. The comments section exploded with outrage. Relatives who had not spoken to me in 5 years suddenly felt compelled to offer their unsolicited opinions. My phone began buzzing relentlessly, sliding across the quartz counter with each new incoming text message. My Aunt Susan demanded to know what on earth I had done to my fragile younger sister. A cousin from Dallas accused me of suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. The messages ranged from frantic confusion to outright condemnation. They were demanding explanations. They wanted me to enter the arena and defend my character against Brenda's vague, devastating accusations. This is the standard operating procedure for a smear campaign. The instigator relies on the target's natural instinct to defend themselves. If you reply, you legitimize their narrative. You engage in a frantic, exhausting debate where the rules are constantly shifting and the truth is entirely subjective. I looked at the glowing screen of my phone, watching the notifications multiply. I did not type a single response. I did not attempt to correct the record. In my professional life, I have managed corporate public relations crises. The golden rule is simple. Do not wrestle a pig in the mud. You both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. I picked up my phone and opened the settings menu. I selected the family group chat and toggled the mute switch, activating it permanently. I disabled the notification banners for my social media applications. I placed the phone face down on the counter, severing their access to my attention. I was starving the fire of oxygen. The silence that followed was profound. A smear campaign is a parasitic entity. It requires continuous fuel to survive. By refusing to engage, I was denying them the very reaction they desperately craved. Brenda expected me to post a frantic rebuttal. She anticipated a chaotic digital brawl that would cement her status as the aggrieved matriarch. Instead, she received absolute radio silence. For 7 days, the gossip mill operated at maximum capacity. The extended family whispered, parsed Brenda's vague status updates, and speculated wildly about the nature of my supposed cruelty. I went to work. I reviewed plat maps. I negotiated land acquisitions. I returned to my peaceful sanctuary every evening, completely detached from the hysterical drama playing out on their digital screens. The turning point arrived the following Thursday. The battle for the narrative shifted from a subjective emotional debate to a matter of objective public record. When you issue a formal notice to vacate in Texas, the document does not simply vanish after the trespassers leave. My corporate attorney, a meticulous professional named David, ensured the paperwork was handled correctly. He filed the formal trespass warning with the Travis County Clerk's office, securing it as a permanent public record attached to the property history. This administrative action acted as a silent, devastating counterattack. My cousin Greg is a commercial insurance underwriter in Houston. He is a pragmatic, analytical man who deals primarily in risk assessment. He read Brenda's hysterical posts and found the narrative lacking crucial factual details. Greg does not rely on gossip. Greg relies on documentation. Using his professional access, he pulled the recent public filings associated with my address. He read the formal trespass warning. He noted the name of the legal entity enforcing the eviction, Lone Star Holdings, LLC. He traced the corporate registration back to the Secretary of State, identifying me as the managing member. He reviewed the original warranty deed, verifying that the property had never been held in my personal name. Greg is not a man who keeps quiet when he discovers a structural flaw. He took a screenshot of the public trespass warning, highlighting the corporate ownership details. He posted the image directly into the main family group chat. He added a single, concise caption outlining the precise legal reality of the situation. He explained that Gemma had not evicted her sister from a personal residence. He clarified that Savannah and Liam had attempted to occupy a commercial asset owned by a holding company without authorization. He detailed the absurdity of demanding a personal quitclaim deed for a corporate property. The revelation dropped into the group chat with the concussive force of a targeted explosive. The shifting dynamics were instantaneous. The family members who had spent a week clutching their pearls and condemning my cruelty suddenly found themselves staring at undeniable proof of my parents' extortion. The narrative inverted completely. Brenda was no longer the heartbroken matriarch defending her pregnant daughter. She was exposed as an aggressive manipulator who had attempted to steal a multi-million-dollar corporate asset using emotional blackmail. The smear campaign collapsed under the crushing weight of public documentation. My Aunt Susan, who had demanded answers a week prior, suddenly sent me a private message offering a sheepish apology. She claimed she had misunderstood the complexity of the situation. Several other cousins reached out, attempting to distance themselves from Brenda's toxic maneuver. I read their messages, but I did not reply. Their apologies were as meaningless as their initial outrage. They had demonstrated their willingness to believe the worst about me without asking a single question. I did not require their validation anymore. Brenda deleted her tearful social media post less than an hour after Greg shared the public records. She retreated into a sudden, uncharacteristic silence. Thomas did not surface to defend his actions. The exposure of their profound legal ignorance and their blatant greed stripped them of their remaining social currency. By refusing to engage in the gossip, I had allowed the truth to reveal itself on its own timeline. I had weaponized my silence, forcing them to overplay their hand. The societal conflict was resolved not through a loud, messy argument, but through the cold, impartial release of a county document. The fire had burned itself out, leaving my parents standing in the ashes of their own ruined reputation. I sat on my wraparound porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The digital noise had been silenced permanently. I had secured my borders against the physical invasion, and I had successfully defended my character against the digital assault. The only task remaining was to finalize the boundaries, defining the new reality of my existence. I picked up my phone, preparing to make one final administrative adjustment to ensure my peace remained permanent. A full year has passed since the diesel engine of that rented moving truck faded into the distance, carrying my family and their unearned entitlement away from my property forever. I am standing on my deep wraparound porch, leaning my forearms against the sturdy wooden railing. The Texas sun is beginning its slow descent over the limestone hills. The sky transforms into a brilliant gradient of crushed violet and burnt orange, mirroring the color of a struck match. The evening breeze carries the dry, familiar scent of cedar and native sagebrush. I hold my blue ceramic mug between my palms, feeling the residual warmth of my evening coffee. The heavy glazed clay grounds me in the present moment. Behind me, the house is quiet and secure. On the exact afternoon my family retreated, I contacted a local commercial locksmith. I did not purchase standard residential hardware. I directed the technician to install heavy commercial-grade deadbolts on every exterior door. The physical barrier serves as a direct reflection of the psychological one. Turning that heavy brass mechanism each night provides a satisfying metallic thud that echoes through the foyer. It is the sound of true sovereignty. I have not heard a single syllable from my parents since the day my cousin Greg posted those public records in the family group chat. There were no frantic phone calls begging for forgiveness. There were no handwritten letters attempting to explain away their extortion. Manipulators rarely apologize when their exposure is undeniable. They simply vanish into the shadows, seeking out easier targets who will not demand accountability. I learned through a passing comment from an extended relative that Savannah delivered a healthy baby boy this past spring. She is raising him in a 2-bedroom rental unit across town. I heard that Liam is struggling to balance his long hours with the demands of a newborn in a small space. Savannah is reportedly furious that her friends have large homes while she remains trapped in an apartment. Her resentment continues to fester, but it is no longer my problem to solve. She did not receive a sprawling backyard or custom oak cabinets. She received the exact life she could afford to build for herself based on her own financial choices. I did not send a baby gift. I did not mail a congratulatory card. Inserting myself into her narrative would only restart the toxic cycle we finally managed to break. I spent my youth trying to fix her mistakes, and releasing that responsibility felt like dropping a heavy weight I had been carrying up a mountain for decades. The silence that sits between my house and theirs is not a punishment. It is a protective perimeter. Occasionally, a colleague or an acquaintance will learn about my estrangement. They will tilt their heads, offering a sympathetic gaze, and ask if I miss my family. It is a natural question for individuals who grew up inside healthy, functional homes. They assume biological separation carries a permanent, agonizing ache. I always look them in the eye and deliver the honest truth. I miss the idea of them. I miss the fantasy of a mother who offers comfort instead of calculation. I miss the concept of a father who protects his daughter instead of viewing her as a disposable asset to be liquidated for spare parts. I miss the illusion of a sisterhood built on mutual respect rather than parasitic envy. But I do not miss the reality of the people who actually occupy those roles. The reality was a suffocating, endless transaction where my worth was measured solely by my willingness to self-destruct. True love does not require a transfer of deeds. A family that demands your financial and emotional ruin as proof of your loyalty is no family at all. They are merely a cartel operating under the guise of kinship. As a land acquisition manager, I spend my days evaluating risk. I look at soil samples, zoning restrictions, and floodplains. I assess whether a foundation can support the weight of a commercial structure. For 31 years, I ignored the structural integrity of my own personal life. I allowed a faulty foundation to remain in place, hoping that sheer willpower could prevent the walls from caving in. When my parents demanded my house, they performed a critical stress test on that foundation. The structure of my childhood failed spectacularly, but the collapse was necessary. You cannot build a sustainable future on ground that is constantly shifting beneath your feet. You have to clear the debris, pour new concrete, and cure it until it turns to stone. This house represents the new foundation. The limestone driveway, the vaulted ceilings, the oak floors are all mine, deeded to a holding company, but earned by the woman standing on this porch. The peace I feel now was worth every ounce of the discomfort required to achieve it. Living in Texas means living in the shadow of legends. The Alamo teaches us to romanticize the final bloody stand. It instructs us to draw a line in the sand and fight until the last breath leaves our lungs. The mythology suggests that shedding blood for a lost cause is the ultimate expression of loyalty. We are conditioned to believe that defending our borders requires a loud, chaotic confrontation, resulting in severe losses. But real power operates differently. I refuse to be a martyr for a family that viewed me as a disposable resource. I refuse to sacrifice my sanctuary on the altar of their convenience. Heroism in the modern age looks different. It looks like setting up a limited liability company. It looks like reading the fine print and understanding that your boundaries are only as strong as the legal framework supporting them. True strength does not announce itself with shouts and threats. It sits quietly behind a desk, filing incorporation papers and establishing corporate entities. Some borders are undeniably worth fighting for. Your peace, your financial security, and your self-respect are territories you must guard with unwavering vigilance. Yet the most profound victories are rarely achieved by raising a sword or screaming until your throat bleeds. The best victories occur when you simply stand still and allow the enemy to defeat themselves with their own unchecked greed. My parents brought a forged emotional narrative to an administrative battlefield. They assumed their entitlement could bend statutory law. They built a trap designed to capture my sanctuary, and they marched themselves directly into the snare. I never had to fire a single shot. I just let the paperwork do the talking. The sun finally dips below the horizon, extinguishing the fiery colors and leaving a cool, bruised twilight in its wake. The crickets begin their rhythmic chirping, hidden deep within the native sagebrush. I take one final sip of coffee from my blue ceramic mug. The liquid is cold now, but the taste remains sharp and grounding. I am Gemma Harrison. I am a land acquisition manager. I own my space. I own my peace. I dictate exactly who crosses my threshold. If you are listening to this, and you are the designated bubble wrap of your family, I want you to hear me clearly. You do not owe your sanity to the people who refuse to carry their own weight. You do not have to sign away your peace to earn a love that should have been yours by default. Stop attending the arguments you are invited to. Start building your own corporate veil. If this story resonates with you, if you have ever drawn a line in the sand and watched the entitled people in your life unravel, tell me your story in the comments below. Share the moment you stopped seeking their approval and started changing your locks. Subscribe to Cherry Drama Stories for more stories of quiet women finding their power, because your silence is an administrative weapon, and it is time you learned how to wield it. The quiet strength of boundaries, a reflection on family and ownership. It's a strange thing standing on a porch that you've had to reclaim from the very people who were supposed to protect you. The wood is the same. The view of the Texas Hill Country is unchanged, but the air feels different. It's lighter, cleansed of a profound, suffocating expectation. For a long time, I believed that love in a family was measured by how much you were willing to bleed for it. I thought that being the good daughter meant silently absorbing the chaos, acting as the structural support for a house built on someone else's sand. I learned through the harsh glare of an attempted theft that true strength doesn't always look like surrender. Sometimes it looks like a locked door and a legally binding document. Growing up, the narrative in my family was clear. Savannah was the delicate center, and I was the perimeter defense. It's a dynamic far too common in American households, where the illusion of harmony is maintained by sacrificing the independence of one child to cushion the vulnerability of another. Parents, often driven by a misguided sense of fairness or a desire to fix what feels broken, redistribute resources, be it time, affection, or in my case, a $750,000 asset, without considering the long-term spiritual and emotional cost. They operate under the belief that familial obligation supersedes personal achievement, confusing love with compliance. When my parents demanded my home for my pregnant sister, they weren't just asking for square footage. They were demanding that I erase my own narrative to ensure Savannah's continued without interruption. They weaponized the very concept of family, threatening to disown me if I didn't perform the role they had scripted. They believed that emotional extortion was a valid parenting tool, assuming my desire for their approval would outweigh my instinct for self-preservation. What they failed to realize is that you cannot build a legacy on extorted ground. True parental guidance in American culture, or any culture that values resilience and honesty, requires teaching children the sacredness of accountability. It means understanding that sparing a child from the consequences of their actions doesn't protect them, it paralyzes them. By constantly buffering Savannah from reality, my parents didn't make her strong. They made her entitled. And by expecting me to foot the bill, they didn't teach me family loyalty. They taught me that my worth was conditional. As a land acquisition manager, I navigate the physical world of deeds, titles, and boundaries. My professional life is governed by clear, unambiguous lines. Yet for 31 years, I allowed the borders of my personal life to remain dangerously porous. I thought that accommodating their demands was an act of grace. I see now that it was an act of self-betrayal. The turning point wasn't a screaming match in the living room. It was the quiet scratch of a silver pen on a quitclaim deed. I signed away an asset I didn't personally own, allowing their greed to collide with the impenetrable wall of corporate law. It was a cold, calculated move, but it was born from a place of profound necessity. When the emotional landscape of your family becomes a minefield, you must rely on the objective reality of administration. From a broader perspective, observing the currents of modern society, there is a spiritual lesson here about self-cultivation. We are often taught that peace is found in endless accommodation, in turning the other cheek until there's nothing left to strike. But true wisdom, the kind that fosters deep moral clarity and resilience, recognizes that some boundaries are non-negotiable. To cultivate a better life, we must first define where we begin and where others end. We must learn to separate the noise of entitlement from the quiet truth of our own worth. To American parents navigating the complex waters of family dynamics, the greatest gift you can give your children is not a shielded life, but the tools to navigate a real one. Teach them that love is not a transaction, and that respect is earned through accountability, not demanded through manipulation. Encourage them to build their own foundations, rather than demanding they dismantle the successes of others to build a shared, albeit fragile structure. To the young people listening, those who feel like the designated bubble wrap of their families, your achievements are not communal property. Your peace is not a currency to be spent on someone else's comfort. You have the right to build a sanctuary, and you have the absolute right to lock the door. The smear campaign that followed their failed invasion was predictable. Families built on optics will always prioritize the performance of victimhood over the hard work of self-reflection. They took to social media, spinning a narrative of cruelty to mask their own avarice. But the truth, much like a properly recorded deed, has a way of asserting itself. The release of the public records dismantled their fiction, leaving them to stand in the quiet wreckage of their own reputation. I didn't have to argue, I just had to wait. I miss the idea of them sometimes. I miss the fantasy of a family that celebrates independence rather than penalizing it. But I do not miss the reality. The reality was a heavy, suffocating debt I never agreed to incur. This experience, this quiet war fought with paperwork and patience, taught me a fundamental truth that goes against much of conventional thinking. We are often told that family is everything, that blood dictates loyalty, but I've learned that the most important border you will ever defend is the one protecting your own spirit. Some wars are won not by fighting, but by realizing the enemy has already trapped themselves. If you've ever had to draw a line in the sand and watch the entitled people in your life unravel, I invite you to share your story. Subscribe to Cherry Drama Stories, where we explore the quiet strength of those who refuse to be consumed. As the sun sets over the hill country, painting the sky in colors of fire and ash, I hold my blue ceramic mug and look out over the limestone drive. The air is still, the house is secure, and I am left with a thought that lingers long after the dust has settled. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't being disowned by your family, but realizing that you never truly belonged to them in the first place. You only belong to yourself. And that, in the end, is more than enough.